Hey there, tonight we're diving into the chaotic world of medieval law courts, where the truth is that your fate might rest on the outcome of a wrestling match or a duel. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy. Maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. So you open your eyes in surprise. You're in the medieval world. That's right, you've time-traveled straight into the Middle Ages, a place where the concept of a morning routine involves more than just hitting snooze. You're not greeted by the smell of freshly brewed coffee or the comforting buzz of your phone alerting you to a new TikTok trend. Instead, you're hit with the earthy aroma of hay-strewn floors and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Welcome to the 12th century, where your modern sensibilities are about to be put through the ringer. First things first, let's talk about who's running the show. You might think you're dealing with a king, but not so fast. This is a feudal society, baby, and power is all about the local lords. They're the ones who call the shots in their neck of the woods, and trust me, their neck is more tangled than a medieval tapestry. The king is more of a distant figurehead. Think of him as the original long-distance relationship. He's got land to manage and wars to fight, so he's not here to solve your local disputes over who stole whose chicken. Now, about these lords. They're like the neighborhood watch, only with more chainmail and less concern about your garden gnome going missing. They hold court in a manner you describe as improvised at best. Picture this. The local hall is packed, and the lord is presiding over a case. He's likely had a few too many goblets of wine, because why would you deal with medieval justice sober? Wine is the medieval multi-tool. It's refreshment, it's social lubricant, and it's disinfectant all in one. If a lord's making decisions, you can bet there's a little vino in the mix. You might be wondering about the legal minds behind all this. Spoiler alert, there are none. The closest thing to a lawyer here is a guy who can read, and even that's a bit of a stretch. Literacy rates are abysmal. Only about 1% of the population can read and write. In this world, being literate is like having an iPhone when everyone else is still using rotary phones. It's rare and a bit magical. Judges. They're often the lords themselves, and let's just say their understanding of due process is about as clear as mud. You've got accusations flying around, evidence that wouldn't hold up in a modern court, and verdicts that are more about keeping the peace than finding the truth. Money talks, my friend, and in medieval courts it practically sings. Justice is a cash transaction, plain and simple. You've got fines, fees, and bribes out the wazoo. If you're wealthy, you're in luck. A hefty purse can smooth over a multitude of sins. For the average peasant, though, it's a different story. They're often on the receiving end of the stick, literally. Punishments can be brutal, ranging from flogging to more permanent solutions. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back to the morning of your new medieval life. You grab some breakfast, likely a piece of bread that's harder than your latest Wordle challenge, and prepare to face the day. You're summoned to the Lord's Hall because apparently you've been accused of something. What could it be? Who knows? The complaint system here is less about innocent until proven guilty, and more about guilty because we said so. The hall is a scene straight out of a historical drama, minus the polished Hollywood sheen. There's a motley crew of villagers, all with their own agendas. You've got the local busybody who's convinced you stole her goat, the blacksmith who thinks you've cursed his forge, and the miller who swears you're after his daughter. It's a medieval soap opera, and you're the unwitting star. As you make your way to the front, you pass through a gauntlet of whispers and suspicious glares. The lord, perched at the head of the room, gives you a once-over. There's no jury here, just the lord and his inner circle, which might include the local priest, a couple of knights, and maybe a particularly trusted servant. It's a grab bag of authority figures, none of whom have passed the bar exam. You stand before the lord, and the proceedings begin. If you're waiting for someone to shout order in the court, you'll be waiting a while. This is more of a free-for-all, with accusations and testimonies thrown around like confetti at a medieval festival. The lord listens, half paying attention, half distracted by the jester's antics in the corner. Oh yeah, there's entertainment here too, because why not? This is a world where everything's a bit of pageantry, even justice. As the morning drags on, you start to understand why you wouldn't last a day in this medieval court. It's not just the lack of due process or the arbitrary nature of the proceedings. It's the sheer unpredictability of it all. The court is a reflection of the chaotic world it inhabits, a place where power and money are the true rulers, and fairness is a concept that's still centuries away from being realized. By now, you're longing for the comforts of modern life, a world where you have rights, representation, and a legal system that, for all its flaws, is at least trying to be fair. But here, in the medieval court, you're just another pawn in a game you don't fully understand. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, the proceedings continue. You're learning the hard way that medieval justice is less about finding the truth and more about keeping the peace. It's about maintaining the delicate balance of power that keeps the feudal system ticking along. And you, dear time traveler, are just along for the ride. Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning of your medieval misadventure. There's still plenty of daylight left, and who knows what other medieval marvels, or miseries, await you. As the sun beams through the dusty windows of the Lord's Hall, casting a glow that's more Instagram filter than natural light, you realize the medieval justice system has just begun to reveal its more colorful quirks. Cue the introduction of a concept that would make even the most hard-nosed modern lawyer break out in hives: the trial by ordeal. Oh yes, nothing says justice quite like a good old-fashioned game of let's see if you can survive this. Let's set the stage. Imagine this. You're standing there, accused of a crime you may or may not have committed, and suddenly the solution is to have you stick your hand into a cauldron of boiling water. Or maybe you're tasked with carrying a red-hot iron bar for a few paces. Talk about upping the ante on your usual truth or dare night. The idea was that if you were innocent, divine intervention would save you from injury. If guilty, well, you'd need a lot more than aloe vera for those burns. This medieval approach to justice might sound like something dreamed up by the producers of a particularly brutal reality TV show, but it was deadly serious. The origins of trial by ordeal are as old as dirt, dating back to ancient legal codes like the Code of Hammurabi. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, these trials were a staple in European justice, an enduring testament to human creativity in the face of limited forensic resources. They weren't just random acts of cruelty, but rooted in the firm belief that God would intervene to protect the innocent. Because, you know, nothing says divine oversight quite like a scalded hand. Now, why did people buy into this fiery form of justice? The answer is a mix of faith, fear, and frankly, a lack of better options. You see, in a world where DNA tests were as fantastical as dragons, and lie detectors hadn't even been conceived, folks relied on what they believed to be divine judgment. The church played a significant role in these trials, often overseeing the process to ensure it was, ironically, fair. Yes, the same institution that preached forgiveness and mercy also supervised some of the most brutal courtroom dramas you could imagine. And let's not forget the psychological element. The sheer terror of facing such an ordeal might have been enough to make a guilty party confess on the spot, saving everyone the trouble of heating up the iron. It was a system that operated on intimidation as much as faith, a precursor to the modern plea deal, minus the legal counsel and air conditioning. Now, before you scoff too much at these practices, consider this. The appeal of such trials lay in their simplicity and immediacy. In a society where the written word was as rare as a day without rain, and legal representation was a distant dream, the trial by ordeal offered a swift, albeit harsh, resolution. It was justice in the rawest form, stripped of nuance, and driven by an unwavering belief in divine justice. But here's the kicker. These ordeals weren't just about physical pain. They were also social spectacles. Picture the entire village gathered around, eyes glued to the unfortunate soul undergoing the trial. It was the medieval version of a blockbuster event, complete with a captive audience, and no doubt, a few vendors hawking their wares to the crowd. The idea of justice being meted out in such a public, visceral way was both terrifying and strangely compelling. It was a communal experience, reinforcing social norms and reminding everyone of the consequences of stepping out of line. And while today we might shake our heads at the barbarity of it all, there's a certain romanticism that lingers around the idea of divine justice. It's the stuff of legends, of epic tales where the hero emerges unscathed from the flames. But as with most things medieval, The reality was far grimmer. The truth is, many didn't walk away from these trials unscathed, and the scars, both physical and emotional, were a testament to a society grappling with concepts of justice, punishment, and divine will. So, as you nervously approach the front of the gathering, the Lord eyes you with a mixture of boredom and curiosity. You're about to be swept up in this medieval madness, a pawn in a game where the rules are as fluid as the river that runs past the village. The trial by ordeal looms large in your mind, a stark reminder that in this world, pain and piety were often two sides of the same coin. As the day drags on, you can't help but wonder what modern equivalent could replace such trials. Perhaps a marathon Zoom call with an impossible deadline, or being stuck in an endless loop of customer service hold music. Whatever it is, you can bet it involves a lot less fire, but probably just as much existential dread. Stay tuned, because in the medieval world, justice isn't just blind. It's often deaf, dumb, and armed with a red-hot poker. Your journey through this bygone era is far from over, and who knows what other bizarre practices you'll encounter in your quest to survive another day in this historical roller coaster. As you stand there, the scent of singed eyebrows still lingering in the air, you begin to realize that the medieval justice system has one last trick up its sleeve: the jury of your so-called peers. Now, I know what you're thinking. Juries are supposed to be fair, right? A group of people who understand your plight, maybe even feel a bit sympathetic. Well, think again. In the medieval world, when we talk about a jury of your peers, we're using the term peer in the loosest sense possible. These folks are about as familiar with due process as your cat is with algebra. So, who are these jurors? Picture this. They're your neighbors, the same ones who watched you bumble through the trial by ordeal with popcorn in hand, metaphorically speaking. But don't expect them to whip out a quill and start taking notes like some medieval court stenographer. Oh no, you're dealing with a jury mostly illiterate, more comfortable with ploughing fields than parsing legal text. Literacy rates in the Middle Ages were an abysmal 5% among the general populace, and even lower among women. If you could read, you were practically a walking Google search. But here's the kicker. These jurors aren't even pretending to be impartial. They're more like a medieval version of a reality TV panel, complete with biases, grudges, and maybe even the occasional side bet on the outcome. You see, the selection process for these juries was less about fairness and more about convenience. Local lords would gather a motley crew of villagers, usually the same folks who knew you, or at least knew of you. These people might have been your drinking buddies at the alehouse, or the ones you outbid at the last sheep auction. In a society where everyone knew everyone else's business, anonymity was about as common as a warm bath in January. Now, let's talk about peer pressure, the medieval kind. It's not just about a bunch of kids daring each other to eat something gross. It's your neighbors deciding your fate, and trust me, they're not above letting a few personal vendettas seep into their decision-making process. If you thought the high school rumor mill was brutal, try living in a medieval village where gossip is practically a way of life. The guy who once caught you sneaking apples from his orchard might just be the one casting the deciding vote on whether you spend the next month in the stocks. But why did they even have juries, you ask? Well, the idea was to involve the community in the justice process, a nod to the notion that justice should reflect the values and norms of the society it serves. It was also a practical necessity. Local lords simply didn't have the manpower to handle every single case themselves. By delegating to a jury, they could maintain order without having to personally arbitrate every squabble over a missing chicken or an adulterous affair. Yet, there's a romantic notion here that even the harsh realities can't fully dispel. It's the idea that justice is a communal effort, that a village should come together to decide what's right and wrong. Sure, it was flawed, and sure, it often resulted in decisions that were more about appeasing the local power structure than actual justice. But there's something enduringly human about it, a reflection of our constant struggle to balance individual rights with the needs of the community. And let's not forget the economic side of things. Justice in the medieval world wasn't just about moral rights and wrongs. It was also about cold, hard cash. Fines were a common punishment, and they could be a significant source of income for the local lord. If your jury decided you were guilty, you could end up paying a hefty sum to the lord's coffers, which certainly provided an incentive for bias. After all, a little extra revenue never hurt anyone. especially when you're the one collecting it. So here you are, standing before this motley crew of amateur legal experts, your fate hanging in the balance. It's a sobering reminder that in this world, justice isn't just blind, it's also a bit nearsighted and occasionally tipsy. And while we might shake our heads at the absurdity of it all, there's a strange sort of logic to it, a reminder that human nature hasn't changed all that much over the centuries. We still grapple with the same questions of fairness, the same struggles between personal interest and the greater good. As the jury deliberates, you can't help but feel a twinge of kinship with those who came before you, who stood in this same spot and faced the same uncertainty. It's a humbling experience, one that strips away the romantic veneer of history and reveals the raw, messy reality beneath. And yet, there's a certain beauty in that messiness, a testament to our enduring quest for justice in all its flawed, imperfect glory. So, as the jurors huddle together, whispering and casting furtive glances your way, you brace yourself for the verdict. In this medieval courtroom drama, you're not just a spectator, you're the star, and the script is still being written. What comes next is anyone's guess, but one thing's for sure, you're in for a wild ride. Stay tuned, because the medieval justice system has more surprises in store, and your journey through this historical labyrinth is far from over. Now, as the medieval jury decides whether your goose is cooked, or if you'll live to see another day in this chaotic age, let's shift gears and dive into the medieval punishment department, a place where creativity and cruelty had a standing appointment. If you thought the trial by ordeal was the pinnacle of medieval madness, buckle up. We're about to explore a punishment menu that's more varied than a modern food truck festival, minus the Instagrammable food pics and artisanal lattes. First up, let's talk about public shaming. While today we might cringe at the thought of a viral tweet gone wrong, back then, public humiliation was an art form. Enter the pillory, a wooden contraption designed to secure your head and hands while you stood in the town square, serving as the village's main entertainment act. Imagine it as the medieval version of reality TV, but instead of getting voted off the island, you got pelted with rotten vegetables. This was the punishment for crimes like cheating the market or petty theft, and it didn't just serve to punish the offender. It was also a warning to everyone else. Step out of line, and you too can become the village's next rotten tomato target. The economic angle here? Well, the pillory was a cost-effective solution. Unlike building a prison, which required resources and manpower, the pillory was a one-time investment. Once built, it served its purpose indefinitely, as long as the wood held together. Plus, it was a public spectacle that kept the community engaged. No Netflix needed. All this while sending a powerful message about law and order. Who knew justice could be so economical? But let's not forget the Starks, a similar device that immobilized the feet and sometimes the arms. It was a slightly less humiliating cousin of the pillory, but no less effective in teaching the offender a lesson while giving the townsfolk something to gossip about. The Starks were often used for offenses like public drunkenness or disturbing the peace. Think of them as a medieval version of a timeout, but with a lot more splinters. Now, if you were really in hot water, and not the trial by ordeal kind, the punishments could escalate. Take corporal punishment, for example. A good old-fashioned flogging was a common method to instill fear and, hopefully, a sense of morality. The whip was a great equalizer, meted out for everything from theft to blasphemy. And let's be real, in a time where washing machines were still centuries away, the idea of a public flogging was as much about making an example of someone as it was about personal hygiene. Nobody wanted to get too close to the smell of unwashed medieval skin. Flogging was also economically strategic. It required minimal resources, just a whip and a strong arm, and delivered immediate results. The law didn't have to worry about feeding prisoners or maintaining a facility. It was quick, brutal, and undeniably effective at making people think twice before repeating their transgressions. Plus, it was a public event, adding to the medieval town square's entertainment lineup, right alongside the juggler and the wandering minstrel. But what if you were accused of something truly heinous, like murder or treason? Well, then the stakes got much higher, often culminating in execution. The most common method, hanging of course. It was the grand finale of medieval justice, drawing crowds from near and far. People would gather not just to witness justice being served, but to participate in a shared community experience. In a world with few diversions, an execution was a social event. Grim, yes, but also a testament to the community's commitment to law and order. The economic considerations of execution were straightforward, while the initial setup, gallows, rope, etc., required some investment. The act itself was straightforward and final. No need for long-term imprisonment or repeated trials. It was a one-and-done approach that ensured the offender wouldn't cause any more trouble. Plus, it freed up resources that could be used elsewhere, like funding the Lord's latest military campaign or repairing the village's crumbling bridge. But let's talk about a punishment that really put the medieval in medieval justice: drawing and quartering. Reserved for the most egregious offences, such as high treason, this gruesome punishment was part deterrent, part spectacle. The condemned would be dragged to the execution site before being hanged, disemboweled, beheaded, and finally chopped into quarters. It was a graphic demonstration of the sovereign's power, and a clear message that defying the crown came with the ultimate price tag. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about setting an example so severe that it would deter even the most rebellious of hearts. The sheer brutality ensured that the tale would be told and retold, embedding itself into the collective memory as a warning against challenging authority. It might sound like the plot of a particularly gory medieval drama, but it was, in fact, a chilling reality for those who dared to play the game of thrones and lost. But medieval punishments weren't just about physical pain. Economic penalties were equally common, especially for those with the means to pay. Fines were a staple of the medieval justice system, and they served a dual purpose. On one hand, they punished the offender by hitting them where it hurt, their wallet. On the other, they provided a steady income stream for the local lord, who could use the funds to maintain his estate or fund his next knightly adventure. The fine system was surprisingly sophisticated, with penalties often scaled based on the severity of the crime and the offender's social status. For instance, a noble might pay a hefty fine for the same offense that would earn a peasant a flogging. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about pragmatism. Nobles had the means to pay, and extracting money from them was far more lucrative than subjecting them to public humiliation. Plus, it kept them in the game, so to speak, ensuring that their wealth and influence remained part of the social fabric. And then there was the pound of flesh concept, sometimes taken quite literally. Debtors who couldn't pay up might find themselves facing harsh physical penalties, from losing a hand to worse. This wasn't just about cruelty, it was about maintaining the economic balance. In a world where every penny counted, debts were a matter of survival, and failure to pay could have dire consequences not just for the debtor, but for their family and community. So there you have it, a tour through the medieval punishment menu that's as varied as it is brutal. Each punishment served a purpose, whether it was maintaining social order, deterring crime, or filling the Lord's coffers. And while we might shudder at the thought of such harsh measures, it's worth remembering that they were products of their time, solutions to the challenges of a world that was as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. As you stand there, contemplating your fate in this medieval madhouse, you can't help but reflect on the strange logic of it all. The punishments, as cruel as they might seem, were a reflection of a society struggling to maintain order in a chaotic world. They were a reminder that justice, in all its forms, is a constant balancing act between mercy and retribution, between the needs of the individual and the demands of the community. And while we like to think we've come a long way since the days of the pillory and the gallows, the truth is, the quest for justice remains as complex and elusive as ever. So stay tuned, because your medieval misadventure is far from over, and there's plenty more to discover in this world where every day is a high-stakes game of survival. And so, as you stand there soaking in the medieval madness, you might be wondering, how on earth did this chaos evolve into the legal system we know today? Fear not, history buff, because the threads from this medieval tapestry of justice are woven into the fabric of our modern legal systems in ways you might not expect. First off, let's talk about the Magna Carta, that famous 1215 document which is often hailed as the cornerstone of modern democracy. King John, under pressure from rebellious barons who had just about enough of his tyrannical antics, essentially signed a medieval version of terms and conditions without the option to scroll down and click, "I agree." This charter introduced the radical idea that even the king was not above the law. It laid the groundwork for the concept of due process, a notion that slowly chipped away at the feudal lord's whimsical brand of justice. And while it didn't instantly transform the legal system into a beacon of fairness and equality, it was a start, a small step towards the idea that law should be based on rights rather than whims and whimsies. Fast forward a few centuries, and we meet the English common law system, a legal framework that emerged not from the minds of philosophers, but from the courts themselves. This was a system built on precedent, where past decisions informed future ones. Think of it as the medieval version of your favorite series recap before a new season, only instead of being entertained, you're informed about legal principles. This approach made the law more predictable and consistent, a far cry from the roulette wheel of medieval courtrooms where your fate depended on who had a grudge against you or how much wine the lord had consumed. Now, here's a twist. Trial by ordeal was officially banned by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the same year the Magna Carta was signed. Coincidence? Probably not. The Church decided that God should not be put to the test, and thus they pulled the plug on this divine game show. This left a vacuum in the justice system that needed filling. Enter the jury trial, a more civilized, if still flawed, method of determining guilt or innocence, while juries in the Middle Ages were as biased and poorly educated as those we described earlier. The concept itself was revolutionary, a move towards a system where a group of peers, not a single lord or divine sign, passed judgment. As the centuries rolled on, the legal world saw the rise of professional lawyers and judges, folks who actually studied law instead of winging it like their medieval predecessors. By the 17th century, England was exporting its common law system across its burgeoning empire, planting seeds that would grow into legal systems worldwide, including in the United States. This system, with its deep roots in medieval chaos, now governs over 1 billion people, a testament to its enduring legacy. But let's not get too romantic. The transition wasn't smooth or swift. It took centuries of legal evolution, political upheaval, and social change to mold medieval justice into the courts we know today. And while the modern legal system is far from perfect, a labyrinth of legalese and loopholes, it's a vast improvement over the haphazard, bribery-ridden ordeal of yesteryear. It's the reason you can expect a fair trial and legal representation, rather than being coerced into sticking your hand in boiling water to prove your innocence. And what about those myths? The medieval period is a playground for myth-making, filled with stories of chivalrous knights and damsels in distress. But the reality is more nuanced. The romantic image of medieval justice as a noble fight for truth is just that, romantic. The truth was a muddled, messy affair, often more concerned with maintaining power and control than with fairness. Yet, the allure of these legends endures, perhaps because they speak to our timeless fascination with heroes, villains, and the eternal quest for justice. So, as you draw your medieval misadventure to a close, take a moment to reflect on the legacy of this chaotic period. Consider the slow march from feudal lords wielding justice like a blunt instrument to the intricate legal systems we navigate today. It's a journey marked by small victories and significant setbacks, shaped by economics, politics, and human nature's quirks. And while the phrase law and order might conjure up images of courtroom dramas on TV, its roots are tangled in the medieval past, where justice was as unpredictable as a roll of the dice. In the end, count yourself lucky that your day in court was just an exercise in imagination. You've traveled through time, witnessed the absurdities and brutalities of medieval justice, and emerged with a newfound appreciation for the labyrinthine but mercifully less hazardous legal system of today. So, next time you find yourself grumbling about jury duty or a parking ticket, remember, at least no one's asking you to carry a red-hot iron bar or face the wrath of a vengeful lord. Now, that's progress. In a small, pastel-colored house in Salzburg, 1756, a baby named Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born, and the world of music unwittingly shifted on its axis. But before you conjure up images of powdered wigs and stately concert halls, let's set the stage straight. Mozart's early years were less about highbrow sophistication and more about a whirlwind tour de force across Europe. with a side of childhood chaos. Mozart wasn't just any kid. He was the offspring of Leopold Mozart, a man with ambition as grand as his son's talent. Leopold, a composer and musician in his own right, saw little Wolfgang's potential almost immediately. And by potential, I mean the kind of raw genius that could make a grown man weep into his harpsichord. By the time Wolfgang was 5, he was already charming the sarks off the Austrian aristocracy, all while probably still losing his baby teeth. Now, if you think going on a European tour is stressful today, imagine doing it in the 18th century. No comfy planes or cushy hotels, just endless roads, creaky carriages, and probably more than a few lice. But the Mozart family was undeterred. Leopold packed up the family, Wolfgang and his equally talented sister Nannerl, and hit the road in 1762. Their first stop, the court of Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna, because why not start at the top? Picture this, a 5-year-old Wolfgang, barely tall enough to see over the keys, dazzling the court with his tiny fingers flying across the clavier. It was like a toddler waltzing into a room full of skeptics and leaving them slack-jawed. The Empress herself was so taken that she reportedly gave Mozart a kiss. Though let's be real, after a performance like that, he probably deserved a standing ovation and a lifetime supply of strudel. But Mozart's family wasn't content with just Vienna. Oh no, they had grander plans. This kid was going to be the original rock star of the classical world, and that meant hitting all the hotspots. Munich, Paris, London, The Hague. Each city was a new opportunity for Wolfgang to blow the minds of dukes, duchesses, and anyone else willing to listen. And if you think today's child stars have it rough, young Wolfgang could probably give them a run for their money in their insane pressure department. Take the time they hit Paris, for example. The City of Lights was a tough crowd, but Mozart, barely 7 years old, performed for King Louis Roman XV at Versailles. Legend has it that he jumped into the king's lap after his performance, a bold move that might have been frowned upon had he not just serenaded the monarch into submission. And there's a delightful rumor that he proposed to the young Marie Antoinette right then and there, a move that would have paired musical genius with future political catastrophe. Alas, their engagement was not meant to be. As the Mozarts travelled, the young prodigy had to contend with more than just demanding audiences. There was the constant travel sickness, the endless rounds of bowing and scraping, and let's not forget the ever-present risk of catching something nasty from the less-than-sterile conditions of the day. But through it all, Wolfgang remained unfazed, perhaps because, in his mind, he was too busy composing symphonies and sonatas to worry about the minor inconveniences of childhood. Of course, Leopold Mozart, ever the savvy manager, wasn't just in it for the applause. Every performance was an opportunity to bolster the family's finances. After all, even a prodigy's genius doesn't pay the bills without a little entrepreneurial spirit. In fact, when the Mozarts reached London in 1764, Leopold pulled off a marketing coup by having Wolfgang perform before King George Roman III and Queen Charlotte. The royal stamp of approval meant that soon enough, everyone who was anyone wanted a piece of young Mozart. Imagine the 18th century equivalent of going viral. Yet, the most remarkable thing about Mozart's early years wasn't just his precocious talent or his relentless schedule. It was his resilience. The little boy from Salzburg had a knack for turning every performance, no matter how grueling, into a triumph. Perhaps it was the unwavering support of his family, or maybe it was simply the unstoppable force of genius. Whatever the case, Mozart's childhood was a whirlwind, a blend of the absurd and the awe-inspiring, setting the stage for a life that would forever alter the course of music history. So, next time you find yourself humming a Mozart tune, spare a thought for the wonder kind who once toured Europe in a rickety carriage, charming kings and commoners alike, all before he was old enough to write his name in cursive. It's a story of talent, tenacity, and a touch of madness, a fitting prelude to the symphony that was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's life. As the carriage wheels of young Mozart's life rolled into his teenage years, the scene shifted from the wonder of precocious performances to the gritty grind of trying to earn a living with music, a task not for the faint of heart or those allergic to powdered wigs. Our prodigy had now returned to Salzburg, a city that was as small as his ambitions were large. Here, the teenage Mozart found himself rubbing elbows, or perhaps more accurately, His father found him rubbing elbows with the Archbishop of Salzburg, Hieronymus Collordo. And if you think working for a church official sounds like a cushy gig, think again. While today's teenagers might rebel by getting a questionable haircut or an ill-advised tattoo, Mozart's rebellion was a bit more melodic. In the cloistered halls of Salzburg, he chafed under the rigid expectations of court life. The Archbishop expected obedience, Mozart offered creativity. The Archbishop wanted solemnity, Mozart delivered spontaneity. It was a mismatch made in heaven, or perhaps in purgatory. His role was more court monkey than court musician, and his creativity was as restricted as a Baroque corset. For his services, Wolfgang earned 150 florins a year, which may sound quaintly lucrative, until you factor in that this was barely enough to keep him in sheet music, let alone strudel. The economic context of 18th century Europe was a bit like a game of musical chairs, minus the music, and with a lot more graft. A concert ticket back then could cost anything from a few groschen to several florins, depending on the venue and the performer. Given that a florin could buy you around 24 loaves of bread, attending a concert was a significant splurge for the average Johann. But for a musician like Mozart, earning enough to live comfortably from performances was a pipe dream unless you were a darling of the aristocracy, which our young rebel was struggling to become. The court life in Salzburg was a far cry from the glamorous image of moody geniuses creating timeless works in candlelit rooms. Instead, it was a lot more about appeasing egos and navigating a social hierarchy as treacherous as a tightrope strung over a pit of alligators. Mozart, with his unabashed love for improvisation and disdain for authority, was about as suited to this environment as a cat to water. His compositions, vibrant and full of life, clashed with the staid and formal expectations of courtly music. It was like trying to fit a symphony into a sonnet, a beautiful disaster waiting to happen. But Salzburg, with its beautiful mountains and suffocating politics, couldn't contain Mozart for long. Italy beckoned like a siren with promises of artistic freedom and adulation. In 1770, at the ripe old age of 14, Mozart embarked on what would be the first of several trips to Italy, a land where music and opera were as vital to life as pasta and political intrigue. Italy was a revelation. Here, Mozart was no longer a boy wonder. He was a maestro in the making, and his travels through Milan, Bologna, and Rome were anything but a Roman holiday. In Rome, he performed before Pope Clement Roman XIV, and legend has it, he heard Gregorio Allegri's Misera only once before transcribing it from memory, a feat that was as audacious as it was impressive, considering that the piece was closely guarded by the Vatican. If Mozart had Instagram, his followers would have been hash-shook. The Italian audiences appreciated Mozart not just as a curiosity, but as a genuine artist, and he responded in kind, composing operas like Mithridate, Ridi Ponto, which premiered in Milan to great acclaim. A teenager writing operas, talk about an overachiever. However, the Italian adventures weren't just about soaking up adulation. They were also a crash course in the cutthroat world of opera. In 1771, Mozart returned to Milan to premiere his opera, Ascanio in Alba. Despite its success, the politics of the theatre world began to reveal themselves. Composers were as much at the mercy of patrons and impresarios as performers were, and even a genius could find himself outmaneuvered by those with the right connections or the wrong intentions. But let's not forget the economic backdrop of Italy, which was as intricate as one of its operatic plots. Musicians could earn anywhere from a pittance to a princely sum, depending on the whims of the nobility. A successful opera might fill your pockets with ducats, but a flop, well, that could leave you busking on the Ponte Vecchio. For Mozart, these trips were not just artistic pilgrimages, but also financial gambles, with his father Leopold playing the role of both manager and bookie. By the time Mozart returned to Salzburg, he was no longer the young prodigy dazzled by the grand tour, but a seasoned musician who had seen the world and its underbelly. The reality of court employment was beginning to chafe even more, and his relationship with Archbishop Collordo was deteriorating faster than a soufflé in a drafty kitchen. Mozart longed for freedom, both artistic and personal, and the grandeur of Italy had only made the confines of Salzburg more stifling. Despite the romantic image of Mozart as the quintessential starving artist, the truth was a bit more complex. Yes, he struggled financially at times, but he also knew how to capitalize on his talents. He performed concerts, taught lessons, and even sold compositions to keep the florins flowing. And while he might not have been rolling in wealth, he was rich in the one currency that mattered most to him, music. As Mozart's teenage years drew to a close, the stage was set for a new act in his life, one that would see him clash with authority, chase his dreams, and ultimately redefine what it meant to be a musician. The transition from precocious child to rebellious teenager was complete. Now, he was ready to take on the world, one symphony at a time. As we leave this chapter of Mozart's life, it's clear that the boy who had once charmed kings was now a man ready to challenge them. But as with any great composition, the best was yet to come. And so, with a heart full of ambition and a head buzzing with symphonies, Mozart set his sights on Vienna, the city where dreams were made or shattered. Vienna in the 1780 was the epicenter of music, a bustling hub where a composer could either rise to dazzling heights or drown in the cacophony of competition. For Mozart, the move was a gamble worthy of a high-stakes poker game, minus the cards, and with a lot more powdered wigs. Vienna wasn't just any city. It was the Las Vegas of classical music, where composers like Haydn and Gluck were household names. But Mozart wasn't content to be just another name in the playbill. No, he was there to carve out his legacy, one note at a time. And boy, did he deliver. Over the next decade, Mozart churned out over 600 works, a feat that would make even the most prolific of modern musicians break out in a cold sweat. But let's not get carried away with the romance of Mozart's genius. The reality of life in Vienna was a bit more sobering. For starters, Mozart had to hustle harder than a street performer with a broken guitar. Gone were the days of steady court employment. This was the age of the freelancer, where every concerto, symphony, and sonata was a potential ticket to financial stability or ruin. And speaking of financial stability, let's talk numbers. In 1781, when Mozart first arrived in Vienna, the cost of living was no joke. A decent apartment could set you back around 300 florins a year. Considering that Mozart's concert tickets could fetch anywhere from 2 to 10 florins, you can do the math and see that he had to play a lot of gigs to keep the landlord at bay. And that's not counting the expense of ink, paper, and the occasional celebratory strudel. But despite the economic pressure, Mozart thrived creatively. He composed operas like The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, each one a masterpiece that pushed the boundaries of the art form. These weren't just musical compositions. They were revolutionary acts of storytelling that tackled themes of class, power, and human folly. And while today we might applaud their brilliance, back then, they weren't always met with open arms. Take The Marriage of Figaro, for instance. Premiered in 1786, it was a satire of the aristocracy that ruffled more than a few feathers. Imagine a modern-day pop star dropping an album that skewers their wealthy patrons. It was a risky move, to say the least. Yet, despite the potential backlash, the opera was a hit with the public, proving that Mozart had a knack for capturing the zeitgeist while thumbing his nose at authority. But life wasn't all symphonies and standing ovations. In 1782, Mozart married Constance Weber, a union that was as much a testament to love as it was to perseverance. Their courtship was a bit of a roller coaster, complete with family drama, financial woes, and enough will-they-won't-they tension to fuel a season of reality TV. But marry they did, and together they navigated the choppy waters of Vienna's social scene. Constance was no mere footnote in Mozart's story. She was a singer in her own right, and a savvy businesswoman who helped manage their household and Mozart's career. The couple had 6 children, though only 2 survived infancy, a harsh reminder of the era's grim realities. Yet through personal tragedies and financial struggles, Constance remained a steadfast partner, a fact often overshadowed by the myth of the tortured genius. Navigating Vienna's musical landscape was no small feat, and Mozart had to constantly reinvent himself to stay relevant. He gave piano lessons to the city's elite, a gig that was as lucrative as it was tedious. Imagine teaching scales to the 18th century, equivalent of entitled teenagers whose passion for music was rivaled only by their interest in napping. But Mozart endured, because every florin earned was a step closer to artistic freedom. Now, let's bust a myth or two. The image of Mozart as a starving artist is both compelling and misleading. Sure, he had his fair share of financial woes, but he also knew how to work the system. He composed on commission, sold his music, and performed at private soirees where the well-heeled Viennese elite would pay handsomely for the privilege of hearing him play. In fact, at the height of his career, Mozart could earn up to 1,000 florins for a single opera, a sum that would make even today's pop stars raise an eyebrow. But Vienna wasn't always kind to its artists. While Mozart's works were celebrated, they didn't always translate to financial security. The city was a fickle mistress, where one day you could be the toast of the town, and the next, yesterday's news. This was a place where patrons' favor could shift as quickly as the Viennese weather, and artists had to be as adept at navigating social circles as they were at composing symphonies. Mozart's prolific output during this time was nothing short of staggering. He composed everything from symphonies and concertos to chamber music and operas, each piece a testament to his boundless creativity. Yet behind the curtain of genius lay the harsh reality of deadlines, demanding patrons, and the constant pressure to produce. It was a double-edged sword. The more he composed, the more he was expected to deliver, a cycle that was as exhausting as it was exhilarating. Despite the challenges, Mozart's time in Vienna was marked by some of his greatest achievements. His operas, particularly Don Giovanni, premiered in 1787, continue to be celebrated as pinnacles of the art form. Don Giovanni was a daring blend of comedy and tragedy that explored the complexities of human desire and morality, a work so ahead of its time that it continues to resonate with audiences today. Yet, even as he penned these masterpieces, Mozart was not immune to the whims of fate. The economic downturn of the late 1780 hit Vienna hard, and the city's patrons tightened their purse strings. Suddenly, the demand for lavish operas and grand concerts waned, leaving composers like Mozart scrambling to make ends meet. It was a sobering reminder that even a genius was not immune to the harsh realities of the marketplace. But if Mozart's life was a symphony, then Vienna was its crescendo. It was here that he solidified his legacy, not just as a composer, but as a pioneer who redefined what music could be. His relentless pursuit of artistic excellence, coupled with his ability to adapt and innovate, ensured that his works would outlive the man himself, continuing to inspire generations long after the applause had faded. As we pause in this chapter of Mozart's life, it's clear that Vienna was more than just a city. It was a crucible that forged his genius. The struggles, triumphs, and relentless pace of life in the Imperial capital shaped him in ways that would resonate throughout history. Yet, as the music played on, the challenges were far from over. The stage was set for the next act, one that would see Mozart confront new adversities, explore new horizons, and ultimately leave an indelible mark on the world of music. But that, dear friends, is a story for another time. As we set our sights on the next act of Mozart's life, it's time to lift the curtain on the not-so-glamorous aspects of his story, where glittering concert halls meet the harsh echo of empty coin purses. While Vienna was indeed a crucible of creativity for Mozart, it was also a boiling pot of social and political tensions, where the aristocracy's whims could make or break a career faster than you could say, allegro. First up, let's tackle the juicy tale of Mozart's supposed rivalry with Antonio Salieri. You know the one. Two musical geniuses locked in a bitter feud, Salieri scheming in the shadows, and Mozart dying with a dramatic flourish on the floor. It's the stuff of Hollywood legend, and like most legends, about as factual as a unicorn sighting. In reality, Salieri and Mozart shared a professional respect, and even collaborated on a cantata for the emperor's wedding in 1785. Sure, Salieri was a bit of a bigwig in Vienna's music scene, but he wasn't lurking in the wings with a poisoned chalice. In fact, Salieri's reputation as the villain in Mozart's life seems to stem from later dramatizations, like Peter Schaffer's Amadeus. In truth, the two composers had a cordial relationship, if not quite a bromance. So, while the idea of Salieri as a mustache-twirling antagonist is deliciously dramatic, it's more fiction than fact. Mozart had enough real-world troubles without a nemesis. Speaking of troubles, let's dive into the financial quagmire that was Mozart's life. Despite his fame, Mozart's finances were like a leaky boat on a stormy sea. The cost of living in Vienna was no small matter. A decent meal could set you back 30 kreutzers, while a pair of silk stockings might cost around 2 florins. Even with his considerable earnings from teaching, composing and performing, Mozart struggled to keep the balance sheet in the black. His penchant for the finer things didn't help either. Think expensive clothes, lavish parties, and a taste for billiards that could rival a shark's. But here's where it gets interesting. Mozart's financial woes weren't just a result of personal extravagance. The late 1780 brought a recession to Vienna, tightening the purse strings of the wealthy patrons who had once been his lifeline. As commissions dried up, so did Mozart's income, and he found himself borrowing money from friends, and even applying for loans from the Masonic lodge to which he belonged. It was a precarious juggling act, made all the more difficult by the societal expectation that artists maintain a certain lifestyle, even when funds were scarce. Now, about those political dynamics. Vienna in the late 18th century was a hotbed of change. The Enlightenment was challenging old ideas, and the Holy Roman Empire, under Emperor Joseph Roman II, was grappling with reforms that sought to modernize its patchwork of territories. Joseph Roman II, with his penchant for shaking things up, was a fan of Mozart's work, but also a ruler who favored Italian opera, complicating Mozart's efforts to gain a foothold with his German operas. The emperor's reforms aimed to strip power from the church and nobility, creating a more centralized state. While this should have been music to Mozart's ears, the reality was a mixed bag. On one hand, the loosening of ecclesiastical authority opened the doors for more secular art forms, giving composers like Mozart a wider canvas. On the other hand, these reforms also meant that the patronage system, which had sustained artists for centuries, was in flux, leaving musicians to adapt or sink. Amidst these shifting sands, Mozart continued to compose at a staggering pace, producing works that were as innovative as they were risky. His operas, like Così fan tutte, premiered in 1790, explored the complexities of human relationships with a wit and depth that resonated with audiences then and now. Yet, despite their artistic merit, these operas didn't always translate into financial success. The fickle nature of Vienna's cultural elite meant that even a masterpiece could be met with indifference, a lesson Mozart learned the hard way. And then there was the personal toll. The pressure to produce, combined with financial strain and personal loss, took a heavy toll on Mozart's health. The death of his father, Leopold, in 1787 was a blow that left Mozart reeling, and though he soldiered on, the weight of expectation and the reality of his circumstances were like a constant shadow. Yet, despite these challenges, Mozart's ability to innovate never waned. His final symphonies, composed in the summer of 1788, are a testament to his genius, each one a complex tapestry of sound that continues to captivate audiences. But even these were not immediately profitable, forcing Mozart to rely on whatever commissions he could secure, from serenades to dance music for Vienna's ever-popular balls. As we peel back the layers of myth and reality, it's clear that Mozart's life was a blend of brilliance and hardship, a testament to the enduring power of creativity even in the face of adversity. His story is a reminder that genius often walks hand in hand with struggle, and that the music we cherish today was forged in a world as complex and challenging as our own. But don't be fooled into thinking this is the end of Mozart's tale. There's more to come as we delve further into the final years of his life, a period marked by both triumph and tragedy, where the man behind the music faced the ultimate test. So stay tuned, because the symphony of Mozart's life is far from over, and the next movement promises to be as riveting as the last. As the curtain rose on the final act of Mozart's life, the stage was set for a blend of brilliance and bewilderment, a crescendo of creativity shadowed by the looming finale. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the prodigy turned maestro, was navigating a world where genius often found itself at odds with reality. By the time 1791 rolled around, Mozart was juggling more than just musical notes. He was balancing the demands of an impermanent world with the eternal legacy he was unknowingly crafting. Despite the financial woes and social uncertainties, 1791 was a year of remarkable productivity for Mozart. This was the year he composed The Magic Flute, an opera that would become one of his most enduring works. Imagine, if you will, a man who had seen both the dizzying heights of success and the humbling depths of debt, crafting a fairy tale opera that intertwined Masonic themes with a celebration of Enlightenment values. The Magic Flute premiered on September 30, 1791, in Vienna's theatre auf der Wieden, and it was an immediate hit. At the heart of this whimsical piece was Mozart's ability to blend profound messages with captivating melodies, making it both a crowd pleaser and a thinker's delight. But even as the applause echoed through the theatre, Mozart's health was faltering. Theories abound about the cause of his death, which occurred on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35. Some blame a rheumatic fever, others suggest a kidney ailment, and of course, there's the ever-popular suspicion of poisoning, a myth perpetuated by the drama of a jealous rival. But let's be clear, there's no solid evidence to support the poisoning claim. In reality, Mozart was a man who had burned brightly, and all too briefly, his health likely compromised by a life lived at a relentless pace. And then there's the matter of his burial. The image of Mozart being laid to rest in a pauper's grave has the tragic allure of a Shakespearean ending, but it's only partly true. While it's accurate that he was buried in a communal grave, this wasn't a reflection of his financial state. In Vienna at the time, such burials were standard practice for citizens, regardless of their wealth or status. It was a pragmatic decision, rooted in the city's policy of maintaining public health and land use. Yet, the idea of a genius buried with the commoners feeds into the romantic notion of the misunderstood artist, underappreciated in his time. Despite his death in relative obscurity, Mozart's music transcended the constraints of his mortal life. His compositions, a staggering 600+ in total, spanned every conceivable genre of his day, from operas to symphonies, chamber music to sonatas. Each piece bore the unmistakable mark of his genius, complex interplay of melody and emotion that continues to captivate audiences centuries later. It's this legacy that elevates Mozart from the man buried in a simple grave to the immortal icon worshipped in concert halls around the world. But how did this transformation occur? The answer lies in the cultural currents of the time. After his death, Mozart's music began to gain the recognition it had sometimes lacked in his lifetime, thanks in part to the efforts of his wife, Constance. She worked tirelessly to preserve and promote his works, organizing memorial concerts and securing the publication of his compositions. Constance's savvy business acumen ensured that Mozart's genius would not be forgotten, a testament to her enduring love and belief in his talent. Moreover, the Romantic movement of the 19th century embraced the narrative of Mozart as the quintessential tortured genius. Composers like Beethoven and Schubert cited him as a key influence, and his works became a staple of the burgeoning concert repertoire. This idealized image of Mozart, combined with the undeniable brilliance of his music, helped cement his status as a cultural icon. It's a reflection of our collective fascination with the artist as an outsider, a figure both of and ahead of his time. In the end, Mozart's story is one of contradictions, a life marked by extraordinary achievements and everyday struggles, a genius whose light shone brightly but all too briefly. His music, however, remains timeless, a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder of the enduring power of creativity. As we look back on the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, we see a man who, despite the challenges he faced, left behind a legacy that continues to inspire and delight. So, the next time you hear a Mozart symphony or hum a tune from the Magic Flute, remember the man behind the music, a prodigy, a rebel, a genius. His story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that true art transcends the boundaries of time and space. In the grand symphony of life, Mozart's notes continue to play on, a melody that never fades. If you'd wandered into Rome around 509 BCE, you might have stumbled upon a rather audacious experiment in governance. The Romans had just kicked out their last king, Tarquin the Proud, because who wants a guy with proud in his name running things right, and decided to try something new. They called it the Republic, a concept that would eventually inspire revolutions and democracies far and wide. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. This was no smooth transition. more like a bumpy cart ride through the Roman countryside. Now, before you start imagining toga-clad senators debating in marble halls, let's set the scene. Rome at this time was less of a sprawling empire and more of an ambitious city-state with a population roughly the size of a mid-sized town today. The early republic wasn't exactly the model of democracy you might expect. Instead, it was a curious blend of aristocratic squabbling and populist rabble-rousing, with a sprinkle of chaos for good measure. The heart of Roman politics was the Senate. Picture a bunch of old dudes in robes, bickering like it's Thanksgiving dinner, and someone just brought up politics. That's the Roman Senate for you. These were the patricians, the aristocratic elite who claimed their ancestors had been around since the founding of Rome. Though whether that was true or just a good way to impress at dinner parties, who can say? They held most of the power and were not exactly known for their generous spirit. In theory, the Senate was supposed to guide the Republic, but in practice, it was more like a high-stakes game of chess where the pieces had minds of their own. The senators were often more interested in outmaneuvering each other than actually governing. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, their constant bickering, this system somehow kept ticking along. Enter the consuls. These were the guys who, for a year, got to say they were in charge. But don't let the title fool you. It was more like being the captain of a slightly dysfunctional ship. There were always two consuls, a nifty little check and balance system to ensure no one got too big for their sandals. Of course, this often meant they spent as much time arguing with each other as they did making decisions. Imagine having a co-CEO at your job, except instead of conference calls, you're dealing with potential invasions and civic unrest. And let's not forget the plebeians, the common folk who made up the bulk of the population. They didn't exactly have a seat at the political table, more like a spot on the floor by the door. Early on, their lack of political power was a major sticking point, leading to the famous conflict of the orders. It was the ancient version of a class struggle, with the plebeians demanding more rights and a say in how things were run. Over time, they gained more power, including the creation of the tribune of the plebs, an office that was supposed to protect their interests. But in true Roman fashion, this too became another arena for political maneuvering. In this vibrant chaos, certain characters stand out, like Lucius Junius Brutus. He's credited with leading the revolt against the last king and setting the Republic in motion. But don't let the heroic image fool you. Brutus's story is a mix of legend and reality, a reminder that history loves a good yarn as much as the next person. Then there's Gaius Marcius Coriolanus, whose story is more Shakespearean tragedy than Roman triumph. Banished from Rome, he allegedly tried to lead an army against his own city. Talk about holding a grudge. The early Republic was also a period of expansion. The Romans were nothing if not ambitious, and they soon set about conquering their neighbors. This wasn't just a matter of territorial pride. It was a practical necessity. The more land they controlled, the more resources they had at their disposal. Think of it as an ancient version of Monopoly, only with more swords and fewer friendly games. But expansion came at a cost. The constant warfare put a strain on the Republic, both financially and socially. Soldiers were often away from their farms for years at a time, leading to economic hardship and eventually social unrest. This was a society constantly on the brink, juggling expansion, internal strife, and the ever-present threat of external enemies. Through it all, the Romans displayed a remarkable ability to adapt and innovate. They tweaked their political system, adjusted their military strategies, and even borrowed ideas from the cultures they conquered. The result was a republic that, despite its many flaws, managed to last for nearly 500 years. Not too shabby for an experiment that started with a king getting the boot. So, what's the takeaway from this Roman escapade? It's a story of ambition, resilience, and a fair bit of dysfunction. The early republic was far from perfect, but it laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most powerful empires in history. And while the senators may have bickered like siblings on a road trip, they were steering Rome toward a future that would change the world. As we'll see in the parts to come, the Republic's story is one of evolution, marked by triumphs and tragedies, and populated by a cast of characters as colorful as any in history. But for now, let's leave them to their debates. After all, there's always another crisis just around the corner. While the senators continued their verbal sparring matches, Rome had its eyes on a grander prize, the Mediterranean. The Romans were like that friend who just can't resist grabbing the last slice of pizza, even if it means wresting it from someone else's plate. Their appetite for expansion was insatiable, and soon enough they locked horns with the only other power that could possibly match their ambition: Carthage. Ah, Carthage, Rome's gritty, seafaring rival from across the pond, or more accurately, across the Mediterranean. If you were expecting two city-states to have a polite tea party, think again. This was going to be a battle royale, with elephants, naval warfare, and enough animosity to fuel a modern reality show. Welcome to the Punic Wars, the series of conflicts that made the Roman-Carthaginian rivalry legendary. The First Punic War kicked off in 264 BCE, lasting a staggering 23 years. That's longer than the entirety of Friends aired on television. By the time it ended in 241 BCE, Rome had snatched Sicily right from under Carthage's nose, adding the island to its burgeoning collection of territories. But don't be fooled by the romantic notion of naval battles and heroic conquests. The reality was grimmer, a logistical nightmare of shipbuilding, supply lines, and a treasury hemorrhaging money. Rome had to innovate, which they did by inventing the corvus, a nifty boarding device that turned naval combat into a land battle, something Romans were far more comfortable with. Now, if you think that would have ended the rivalry, you'd be misjudging human obstinacy. Enter the Second Punic War, which kicked off in 218 BCE, largely thanks to a young Carthaginian general with a flair for the dramatic, Hannibal Barca. Picture this: a man who decided the best way to surprise Rome was by marching an army, complete with elephants, over the Alps. Yes, elephants in the Alps, because why not add a touch of absurd to your military strategy? Hannibal's trek is the stuff of legend, and while it sounds like a whimsical adventure, it was a brutal ordeal. Out of his initial 40,000 troops and 37 elephants, only a fraction survived the punishing journey. But those who did were enough to give Rome a run for its money. Hannibal was a military genius, no doubt about it. He won several critical battles on Roman soil, including the infamous Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where he outmaneuvered the Romans and inflicted staggering casualties. Some estimates suggest up to 70,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a single day. Imagine the panic in Rome, a city that usually did the conquering rather than being conquered. Yet despite these victories, Hannibal found himself unable to deliver the knockout blow. That's the thing about Rome. Like a stubborn weed, they just kept coming back. Rome's resilience in the face of disaster wasn't just because they had a never-ending supply of soldiers, though that certainly helped. It was their ability to adapt and take the long view. They refused to engage Hannibal directly after Cannae, instead opting for a war of attrition. They harassed his supply lines, avoided direct confrontation, and gradually reclaimed lost territories. It was like death by 1,000 cuts, and Hannibal, despite his brilliance, found himself gradually outmaneuvered. Then came the turning point, the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, decided that the best defense was a good offense and took the fight to Africa, Hannibal's home turf. With a combination of strategic brilliance and a bit of luck, Scipio defeated Hannibal, effectively ending the Second Punic War. Carthage was left battered, its military ambitions shattered. The peace terms were harsh. Carthage had to pay massive reparations and cede its fleet, effectively neutering it as a military power. Talk about kicking someone when they're down. But the Romans weren't done yet. The Third Punic War, starting in 149 BCE, was less about military necessity and more about a grudge match. Rome, perhaps feeling a bit too big for its gladiatorial boots, decided that Carthage had to be destroyed once and for all. By 146 BCE, Carthage was razed to the ground, its fields sown with salt as a symbolic gesture to ensure nothing would grow there again. It was overkill, sure, but Rome wasn't about leaving loose ends. The phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, became a Roman rallying cry, showing just how deep the rivalry went. So, what's the takeaway from all this Mediterranean melodrama? The Punic Wars were a testament to Rome's relentless ambition and adaptability. They weren't the squeaky clean heroes of popular imagination. Their victories were earned through dogged persistence, strategic innovation, and a willingness to play the long game. The romantic notion of Roman invincibility glosses over the sheer grit and occasional ruthlessness that defined their rise to power. And as for the elephants, well, they became a kind of symbol for the audacity and ultimate futility of standing in Rome's way. These conflicts set the stage for Rome's transformation from a regional power to a sprawling empire. With Carthage out of the picture, Rome could expand into North Africa, Spain, and beyond, setting its sights on the wider Mediterranean world. But as we'll explore next, this expansion wasn't just a tale of glory and riches. It came with its own set of challenges: economic pressures, social upheaval, and the ever-present threat of internal discord. Rome may have conquered the Mediterranean, but it was about to discover that holding on to an empire is a whole new kind of challenge. Stay tuned, because if you thought the Punic Wars were dramatic, you haven't seen anything yet. As Rome basked in the glow of its Mediterranean dominance, it was quietly setting the stage for its own internal drama, the kind that would make a modern soap opera look like a calm afternoon tea. Enter Julius Caesar, the man whose very name would become synonymous with power, betrayal, and audacious political theater. If you think your office politics are intense, just wait until you hear about Caesar's gamble at the Rubicon. It's 49 BCE, and Caesar is chilling in Gaul. Well, chilling might be a bit of a stretch considering he's just wrapped up a decade-long military campaign, subjugating the Gallic tribes. During this time, he's amassed not just territory, but also a loyal army, and critically, a mountain of debt that would make a credit card company blush. But Caesar wasn't just any military leader. He was the kind who could convince his soldiers to march into the jaws of hell with nothing more than a rousing speech and a hefty promise. Back in Rome, the political situation was as tumultuous as ever. The Senate, that august body of squabbling aristocrats, was increasingly divided between the optimates, who believed in preserving the status quo read, their own power, and the populares, who appealed to the common folk. Caesar, ever the populist, aligned himself with the latter, much to the chagrin of the Senate's old guard. His triumphant return to Rome was less of a homecoming and more of a looming threat, like a storm cloud on the horizon. The Senate, led by Pompey, Caesar's former ally turned rival, ordered him to disband his army and return as a private citizen. Essentially, they were asking him to walk into Rome with nothing but his toga and a smile. Caesar, however, had other plans. On January 10, 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act of war against the Senate's authority. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a bold declaration. According to the historian Suetonius, Caesar supposedly uttered the phrase, "Alia iacta est," or "the die is cast," as he made his fateful crossing, which in today's terms would be something like, "Let's roll the dice." This single act set off a civil war that would forever alter the course of Roman history. The ensuing conflict was more than just a battle for supremacy. It was a struggle for the soul of Rome itself. Caesar's forces clashed with those loyal to Pompey across the Roman world, from Spain to Greece, culminating in the decisive Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's strategic brilliance shone through, leading to a resounding victory. Pompey fled to Egypt, where, in a tragic twist worthy of a Shakespearean play, he was assassinated, a political hit orchestrated by Ptolemy Roman XIII, the young Egyptian king hoping to curry favor with Caesar. Yet, if Caesar expected a warm reception in Egypt, he was in for a shock. He was instead greeted by a power struggle between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra. Ah, Cleopatra. The very name conjures images of opulence and intrigue. She wasn't just a pretty face in a fancy headdress. She was a political operator par excellence. Caesar, ever the opportunist, aligned himself with Cleopatra, not just politically, but also personally, if you catch my drift. Their alliance bolstered Cleopatra's claim to the throne, and in return, she gave Caesar not only a son, Caesarion, but also a foothold in Egypt. With Egypt in his pocket and Pompey out of the picture, Caesar returned to Rome in triumph. In 46 BCE, he was declared dictator for 10 years, a title that had all the permanence of a temporary tattoo, but with far-reaching consequences. He initiated a series of reforms, from restructuring debt to reforming the calendar. Yes, you can thank or curse Caesar for those awkward 28-day Februaries. His actions weren't purely altruistic. They were calculated moves to consolidate power and stabilize Rome's chaotic political landscape. But power, as they say, corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Caesar's title was extended to Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life, in 44 BCE. This was the final straw for many in the Senate who feared the Republic was slipping into monarchy, a system they'd overthrown centuries earlier. Enter the Ides of March, 44 BCE, a date that would become synonymous with betrayal. As Caesar entered the Senate, he was surrounded by a group of conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. In a brutal act of political theater, they stabbed him 23 times. As Shakespeare would later dramatize it, Caesar's last words were "Et tu, Brute," though whether he actually said this, or anything at all, remains up for debate. The assassination was supposed to restore the Republic, but instead it plunged Rome into further chaos. Power vacuums have a nasty habit of sucking in all sorts of characters, and the aftermath of Caesar's death was no exception. Enter the triumvirate of Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir. If you thought the drama was over, think again. This was the Roman equivalent of Game of Thrones, complete with shifting alliances, betrayals, and epic battles. Octavian, who later rebranded himself as Augustus, was the dark horse in this race for power. Young and relatively untested, he was initially underestimated by his rivals. But Augustus was no ordinary politician. He was a master of propaganda and a shrewd operator. He deftly maneuvered through the political minefield, outsmarting Antony and Lepidus. By 31 BCE, after a series of bloody conflicts, including the famous naval battle of Actium, Augustus emerged as the uncontested ruler of Rome. With Augustus at the helm, Rome transitioned from a fractious republic to a centralized empire. But Augustus was smart enough to cloak his autocracy in the trappings of republicanism. He took on the title of princeps, or first citizen, rather than king or emperor, a clever bit of branding that maintained the illusion of restored republican values. In reality, Augustus wielded absolute power, reshaping Rome into an imperial powerhouse. Augustus' reign brought about the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability that lasted for over 2 centuries. Under his leadership, Rome saw unprecedented prosperity, with infrastructural developments like roads, aqueducts, and monumental architecture, including the iconic Ara Passes. The economy flourished, partly due to the expansion of trade routes and the entrenchment of Roman law and governance across its territories. Augustus even instituted a professional army, a move that ensured loyalty and stability, as soldiers were now beholden to the emperor rather than individual generals. Yet, Augustus' rule wasn't without its darker shades. The Senate's power was effectively neutered, with Augustus holding the keys to the kingdom. His regime was marked by censorship and the suppression of dissent, ensuring that his vision of Rome went unchallenged. But history, in its ironic way, often remembers Augustus as the man who brought order out of chaos, the architect of an empire that would shape the course of Western civilization. So here we are, at the dawn of the Roman Empire, an era of grandeur and glory, but also one built on the ashes of republican ideals and the legacy of a man who dared to cross the Rubicon. But don't get too comfortable. The story of Rome is far from over. Augustus may have set the stage, but the drama is just beginning. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the empire's golden age and the challenges that lay ahead. As the sun set on the Republic and rose on the Roman Empire, Augustus had given the world the Pax Romana, a supposed era of peace and stability. But don't let the marketing fool you. In reality, this was less peace, and more like the calm you feel when you finally gotten your toddler to nap, but you know chaos lurks around the corner. The Pax Romana, spanning from 27 BCE to 180 CE, was a time when Rome flexed its muscles and pretended everything was fine, even as it tiptoed through a minefield of intrigue and instability. Let's start by pulling back the curtain on this so-called peace. Sure, major battles were largely absent within the empire's borders, but that doesn't mean everyone was holding hands and singing Cumbia. Instead, Rome's own brand of peace involved keeping a lid on internal dissent with an iron fist and expanding its borders through strategic, sometimes ruthless, diplomacy and the occasional military intervention. Think of it as the ultimate real estate empire, where eviction notices came in the form of legions. Economically, the Pax Romana was like a Roman toga, elegant on the outside, but with a few loose threads if you looked too closely. The empire's economy was booming, thanks to a network of trade routes that would make Amazon jealous. Goods flowed in from every corner of the empire: Egyptian grain, Spanish olive oil, and exotic spices from as far away as India. The Roman road network, with over 250,000 miles built by the end of the 1st century, was like the interstate highway system of antiquity, ensuring that trade and Roman influence traveled far and wide. But let's not get carried away with romantic visions of bustling markets and multicultural harmony. The empire's economy was also a house of cards. It relied heavily on slave labor, with an estimated 1 in 3 people in Italy being a slave. This not only fueled economic growth, but also sowed the seeds for future unrest. The disparity between the fabulously wealthy elite and the struggling masses was as stark as the contrast between a Roman banquet and a plebeian's meager meal. The rich lived in opulent villas, while the poor crowded into insulae, the ancient equivalent of tenement housing, where the risk of fire was as constant as the gossip around the communal water well. While Augustus was the master architect of this era, his successors often seemed more interested in personal indulgence than political stability. Enter the emperors with hobbies as questionable as a reality TV star's talent. Take Caligula, for instance, who ruled from 37 to 41 CE. His reign was a masterclass in absurdity. Legend has it that he appointed his horse, Insidatus, as a consul. While this might just be a colorful exaggeration, it highlights the perception of his erratic and extravagant rule. Caligula's penchant for parties and peculiar decrees made him more of a tabloid sensation than a statesman, and his assassination by disgruntled guards was about as surprising as a plot twist in a soap opera. Then there was Nero, ruling from 54 to 68 CE, who fancied himself as an artist, was more interested in strumming his lyre and performing on stage than in governing. Nero's reign saw the infamous Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which destroyed much of the city. Rumors, likely exaggerated, claim he fiddled while Rome burned, though it's more likely he was composing poetry or rehearsing for his next public performance. Nero's subsequent decision to build a lavish palace, the Domus Aurea, on the ruins didn't exactly endear him to the public. His reign ended in chaos and rebellion, culminating in his suicide, which, in a macabre twist, he reportedly did while quoting, "What an artist dies in me." Despite the occasional mad emperor, Rome's administration was surprisingly resilient. The bureaucratic machinery was well-oiled, keeping the empire running even while its leaders were off indulging their whims. The secret to this stability lay in the Roman talent for governance and law. Roman law, with its emphasis on rights and responsibilities, became a cornerstone of Western legal tradition. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials who reported back to the emperor. This system allowed Rome to maintain control over its vast territories and ensured that any whispers of rebellion were quickly silenced. But unity was more illusion than reality. Behind the marble facades and the orderly streets lay a society teeming with political intrigue and power struggles. Senators plotted in shadowy corners, generals eyed the throne with ambition, and provinces simmered with potential revolt. The empire was a delicate balancing act, a tightrope walk between order and chaos. The Roman emperors were like circus performers, juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle on a high wire. Despite the internal tensions, the Roman Empire at its height was a marvel of the ancient world. The city of Rome itself was a bustling metropolis, home to over 1 million people. Its architecture was nothing short of awe-inspiring. The Colosseum, completed in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, could seat 50,000 spectators. It was the epicenter of Roman entertainment, where gladiators fought to the death and naval battles were reenacted for public spectacle. The Pantheon, with its majestic dome, remains an architectural wonder to this day, a testament to Roman engineering prowess. Yet beneath the grandeur lurked the reality of an empire always on the brink. The Roman military, the backbone of the empire, was a double-edged sword. It protected Rome's borders and projected its power abroad, but it also represented a threat to imperial authority. Ambitious generals with armies loyal to them rather than to Rome itself posed a constant danger of insurrection. This was the empire's Achilles heel, a vulnerability that would eventually contribute to its downfall. The Pax Romana, with all its contradictions, was a period of immense cultural and intellectual flourishing. Roman literature, art, and philosophy thrived. Writers like Virgil and Ovid penned works that would resonate through the ages, while philosophers like Seneca explored the complexities of human nature. But let's not romanticize too much. These cultural achievements often happened in spite of the political chaos, rather than because of any grand imperial vision. As we sail further into the choppy waters of Roman history, remember this. The Pax Romana was as much about the art of illusion as it was about peace. It was a time when Rome wore a mask of stability, even as its foundations trembled with the undercurrents of discontent and ambition. The empire's legacy is one of grandeur and decay, achievement and hubris. And as we move forward, we'll see how these contradictions continue to shape Rome's destiny, like a soap opera with no end in sight. So stay tuned, because the plot is about to thicken, and the drama is far from over. As we sail further into the choppy waters of Roman history, remember this. The Pax Romana was as much about the art of illusion as it was about peace. It was a time when Rome wore a mask of stability, even as its foundations trembled with the undercurrents of discontent and ambition. The empire's legacy is one of grandeur and decay, achievement and hubris. And as we move forward, we'll see how these contradictions continue to shape Rome's destiny, like a soap opera with no end in sight. Now, let's dive into the dawn of Rome's decline, where the empire's shimmering facade began to crack, revealing the chaos lurking beneath. The decline of the Roman Empire is often painted with broad strokes, barbarians at the gates, dramatic battles, and a mighty civilization crumbling in spectacular fashion. But the truth is far more complex, and quite frankly, not as cinematic as Hollywood might have you believe. First, let's tackle the myth of the barbarian invasions. Yes, the Goths, Vandals, and Huns did play a role, but to say they single-handedly toppled Rome is like blaming a single straw for breaking the camel's back. By the time these tribes rolled in, Rome was already a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal decay and mismanagement. In fact, if you're looking for a scapegoat, you might want to point a finger at Rome itself. Economically, Rome was a hot mess. The empire was hemorrhaging money faster than you could say Imperial overstretch. Maintaining a military presence across vast territories drained the coffers. Estimates suggest that by the 4th century, the Roman army required an astronomical 600,000 pounds of gold annually just to stay operational. The empire's solution: print more currency, an ancient version of quantitative easing that tanked the silver content in the denarius, causing inflation to skyrocket. Fancy a loaf of bread. That'll be 2,000 denarii, please. This economic mismanagement was like a slow poison, eroding Rome from the inside. And let's not forget the political circus. The empire's leadership was less about governing and more about who could backstab their way to the top. Between 235 and 285 CE, Rome saw a rapid turnover of emperors, about 20 in 50 years, many meeting their end through assassination. It was like a deadly game of musical chairs, where the music never stopped, and the stakes were life and death. This instability undermined any coherent policy-making and left the empire vulnerable to external threats. But the real Achilles' heel was Rome's bureaucratic behemoth. The empire was drowning in red tape, with a labyrinthine administration that would make a modern-day DMV look like a model of efficiency. Taxation was a nightmare, with local officials squeezing every last drop out of the provinces to meet Rome's insatiable demands. The result: widespread resentment and rebellion, as local populations grew tired of financing the empire's insatiable appetite for grandeur. Meanwhile, the Roman legions, once the backbone of imperial might, were now a liability. The army was stretched thin, defending an empire that spanned from Britain to the Middle East. Moreover, it was increasingly filled with mercenaries and non-Romans, men whose loyalty could be bought but not guaranteed. When push came to shove, these soldiers were more interested in their paychecks than in the glory of Rome, and who could blame them? Fighting for a crumbling empire doesn't exactly inspire the same zeal as defending a burgeoning republic. Now, back to those infamous barbarian invasions. The Goths, for instance, weren't initially out for blood. They were migrants seeking refuge from the Huns, hoping for a slice of Rome's prosperity. It was a botched immigration policy, rather than savage hordes, that led to the fateful Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, where the Roman army suffered a crushing defeat. This battle was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that Rome could no longer bully its way out of trouble. And then there was the sack of Rome in 410 CE by the Visigoths, led by Alaric. This wasn't just a military triumph, it was a psychological blow. Rome, the eternal city, had been violated, its aura of invincibility shattered. Yet in a twist of historical irony, Alaric wasn't bent on destruction. He wanted to negotiate, to be part of the Roman system. But Rome's inability to adapt, to reform, and to bring these new players into the fold left it vulnerable, a relic clinging to past glories. By 476 C, when the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, it was less a dramatic collapse and more a shrug of resignation. The western half of the empire was simply absorbed into the patchwork of emerging European kingdoms. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years, proving that while Rome's western half had crumbled, the idea of Rome was far from dead. So, what's the takeaway from Rome's grand finale? The empire didn't fall with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper, undone by its own excesses and inability to adapt. Its decline was a slow unraveling, a cautionary tale of how even the mightiest of empires can falter under the weight of their own contradictions. In the end, the Roman Empire is a testament to the complexity of history. Its story is one of remarkable achievements and spectacular failures, of visionary leaders and tragic hubris. Rome gave us roads, laws, and a cultural legacy that still echoes through time. But it also serves as a reminder that no empire is too big to fail, and that sometimes the most formidable foe lies within. As you drift off to sleep, ponder this. Rome was both a beacon and a warning, a civilization of unparalleled influence that ultimately succumbed to its own grandeur. Its legacy is a mirror, reflecting the heights humanity can achieve and the pitfalls it must navigate. And as we say goodnight to the eternal city, remember that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a tapestry of human ambition, folly, and resilience. Sweet dreams of emperors and empires, of triumphs and tragedies, and the ever-fascinating dance of history. You open your eyes to the sound of clattering wheels and the distant mooing of cattle. Welcome to a typical morning in a 14th century European town. The air is thick with the smell of, well, let's call it rustic. It's a blend of smoke from wood fires, the sharp tang of rotting vegetables, and the unmistakable aroma of unwashed humanity. Ah, the sweet perfume of medieval life. As you step into the narrow streets, dodging a freshly emptied chamber part hurled from an upper window, you might wonder why anyone would choose to live in such close quarters. The answer is simple: survival. The medieval city is a bustling hub of trade, opportunity, and, unfortunately, disease. But let's focus on the brighter side of this medieval morning, shall we? The streets are alive with vendors shouting about their wares. You might be tempted by the ripe, if slightly bruised, apples at one stall or the pungent cheese at another. The real draw, though, is the fresh turnip, a staple in every sensible medieval diet. Sure, it's not exactly filet mignon, but hey, it's rich in vitamins and keeps the scurvy at bay. If you're lucky, you might snag one for a few pence, but be prepared to haggle. A good haggler can save enough for a pint of the local ale, assuming you trust the water quality. As you navigate these bustling streets, it's easy to forget that the Black Death lurks just around the corner. But in this era, forgetfulness is a luxury, and the plague is a constant shadow. The Black Death, which would soon decimate nearly a third of Europe's population, is about to become the great equalizer. Before it hits, though, the economy has its own strange quirks. Labor is cheap because, well, there are so many people. Landlords are raking it in from rents, and the idea of a rat-free home is as mythical as a dragon-slaying night. Rats, you see, are an accepted part of life, like taxes and bad weather. They scuttle past your feet, more roommates than pests. And let's not even start on the fleas. These tiny hitchhikers are the real stars of the show, spreading Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the plague. But for now, they're just another part of the medieval tapestry, like the market crook trying to sell you authentic relics of saints. Yet, amidst this chaos and the looming threat of disease, there's an economic revolution brewing. The Black Death will flip the script, turning labor into a precious commodity. Wages will soar as the workforce dwindles. Peasants will have bargaining power like never before, demanding better conditions and pay. This isn't just a pandemic, it's a catalyst for seismic social change. Until that day arrives, you have your daily grind to contend with. The streets are your classroom, the market your boardroom. You learn to read people and prices, to navigate the nuances of medieval commerce. Your survival depends on it. So does your ability to dodge the occasional flying refuse. It's a tough life, but it's yours. As you make your way back home, you might pause at the town square, where the local bard spins tales of chivalry and romance. Sure, it's all exaggerated. Knights aren't quite as noble as they seem, and damsels in distress are more likely to be worrying about the next harvest than waiting for rescue. But the stories provide a welcome escape from the gritty reality of medieval life. It's important to remember that this isn't just a time of grime and struggle. There's beauty, too, in the bustling energy of the marketplace, in the resilience of the people around you. These are the same streets where artisans craft intricate tapestries and where builders raise cathedrals that will stand for centuries. It's a world where the extraordinary and the mundane coexist, where every day is a balancing act between survival and hope. By the time the sun dips towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, you've navigated a full day in medieval Europe. You've haggled, dodged, and learned. Tomorrow might bring the Black Death to your doorstep, but today you've survived with a pocketful of turnips and maybe a story or two to tell. Remember, history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about the people who lived it in all their flawed, vibrant humanity. As you walk back to your medieval hovel with your sack of turnips and a head full of bardic nonsense, the shadow of the Black Death looms larger than the cathedral spires. You might think you've got a handle on this medieval life thing, but spoiler alert. The plague is about to crash the party like an uninvited guest who drinks all your ale and eats the last piece of cheese. This isn't just any pestilence, it's the Black Death, the ultimate medieval mic drop that's about to rewrite the rules of survival, society, and economics. Let's talk about how this little bacterium, Yersinia pestis, went on an epic world tour, traveling from Asia to Europe, faster than you can say, rat-infested ship. The plague's journey began somewhere in the arid plains of Central Asia, possibly near the Tian Shan Mountains, around the early 1330. It hitched a ride along the Silk Road, the medieval version of an international highway, bustling with traders carrying silk, spices, and as it turns out, doom in the form of flea-infested rats. By 1347, plague had reached the bustling port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. Here, the Mongol army inadvertently weaponized it, catapulting infected corpses over the city walls during a siege, a macabre early attempt at biological warfare. From there, the plague spread like gossip about a scandalous affair. Ships carried it to Constantinople and then to Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. Within months, it was wreaking havoc in Genoa and Venice, and by June 1348, it had reached the British Isles. The plague had gone viral in the most gruesome way possible, and no one was safe, not the rich in their castles, nor the poor in their shacks. It was the great equalizer, striking down nearly a third of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. That's around 25 million people. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a social and economic earthquake that left no stone unturned. The speed of infection was terrifying. Infected people often died within 3 to 5 days after the first symptoms appeared. Imagine waking up with a headache and a fever, only to be dead by the weekend. It was like medieval fast food, but in the worst possible way. Symptoms included fever, vomiting, and the infamous buboes, painful swellings of the lymph nodes that turned black, hence the name, Black Death. If you saw someone with these symptoms, your best bet was to run faster than if you just insulted the king. Medieval medicine was about as effective against the plague as a paper shield in a sword fight. Physicians relied on humoral theory, the idea that disease was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. Their treatments included bloodletting, which is exactly what it sounds like, draining blood to balance the humors. Spoiler, it didn't work. Leeches were also popular, but they were about as useful as a medieval pop song. A lot of hype, but no healing power. Other remedies included drinking potions made of crushed emeralds or sitting in a sewer to counteract the poisoned air. Yes, you heard that right. Sitting in a sewer was considered a health treatment. You can practically hear the sound of modern doctors facepalming across the centuries. And let's not forget the plague doctors with their iconic bird masks. You might picture them as medieval PPE heroes, but let's burst that bubble. The masks were designed to protect against miasma, or bad air, which was thought to spread the disease. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs to filter out the stench of death. But in reality, these doctors had as much chance of curing the plague as a knight had of surviving a dragon encounter. The mask was more psychological comfort than actual protection, like a security blanket for doctors who were in way over their heads. In the midst of all this grim reality, myths and misunderstandings about the plague flourished. Some people believed it was a punishment from God, while others blamed it on everything from planetary alignments to bad omens. Jewish communities were often scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells, a tragic reflection of the period's rampant anti-Semitism. In Strasbourg, for example, around 2000 Jews were burned alive in 1349, illustrating how fear and ignorance can lead to horrific violence. Yet, beneath this chaotic tapestry of death and superstition, a strange new world was emerging. As the plague decimated the workforce, labor became a rare and valuable commodity. Survivors found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Landlords, desperate to keep their fields productive, were forced to increase wages and improve working conditions. The rigid feudal system began to crack, leading to social mobility that was unheard of before the Black Death. Peasants could demand better treatment, and many used their newfound leverage to move to towns and cities, seeking better opportunities. The economic impact was staggering. With a third of the population gone, demand for goods plummeted, leading to deflation. The price of land dropped, and for those who survived, there was often more land available than they could manage. This shift in the balance of power between landlords and peasants would lay the groundwork for the end of feudalism and the beginnings of the modern economy. As the sun sets on this plague-ridden day, you realize that while the Black Death is an epic tragedy, it's also a catalyst for seismic change. Out of the ashes of the old world, a new social order is emerging, one that will eventually give rise to the Renaissance and reshape the future of Europe. But for now, you have survived another day, dodging death and dodgy remedies with a mix of luck and pluck. Keep your wits about you. The story of the Black Death is far from over, and tomorrow there's more to unravel in this dark, transformative chapter of history. And just like that, you find yourself at the medieval equivalent of noon, stomach growling like a knight's warhorse before battle. But forget about gourmet lunches. With the Black Death in town, it's more like survivalist snacking. You grab a stale hunk of bread and some not-quite-rotten cheese, a meal fit for someone who's dodged death and bad hygiene in equal measure. Now, let's talk about the societal upheaval caused by the plague, because, believe it or not, this microbial nightmare was the medieval instigator of a social revolution. Picture it. Landlords, once the untouchable elite, are now practically groveling before the very peasants they'd have sooner ignored. Why? Well, with one-third of their labor force suddenly and dramatically out of the picture, getting someone to plow fields became a challenge akin to finding a decent Wi-Fi signal in a basement. Suddenly, the tables have turned. Peasants were in short supply and high demand, so they started calling the shots. You might even say they were the original gig economy workers, picking and choosing their gigs based on who offered the best terms. Landlords, desperate to keep their crops from rotting in the fields, began offering bonuses, better wages, and even the medieval equivalent of a signing bonus. It was the 14th century version of a tech startup offering stock options, only instead of shares, you might get a goat. And this wasn't just a brief fad. The labor shortage caused by the Black Death laid the groundwork for the decline of the feudal system, a centuries-old institution that suddenly found itself on shaky ground. With peasants able to negotiate for better conditions, the rigid social structure of lords and serfs started to crumble. It was like watching a game of Jenga played by overconfident toddlers. The tower was bound to fall. Even more mind-blowing was the early rise of something we might call proto-feminism. With so many men wiped out by the plague, women found unexpected opportunities. They stepped into roles traditionally held by men, running businesses, managing farms, and even wielding hammers in the burgeoning guilds. It wasn't the full-blown feminist movement, but it was a crack in the patriarchal armor. Women began to gain a degree of economic independence, albeit one that was still heavily constrained by the norms of the time. But hey, a crack is how the light gets in, right? Meanwhile, the church, that bastion of medieval certainty, was enduring its own crisis. Imagine being the institution people turn to for divine intervention, only to find that your prayers seem to be going straight to voicemail. The plague exposed the church's limitations in the most brutal way possible. Faith healers couldn't heal, and holy relics didn't hold up against microscopic invaders. The church's authority, previously as unshakable as a monk's vow of silence, started to waver. People began questioning the church's narrative. If a loving deity governed the universe, why was suffering so indiscriminate? It was a theological conundrum that even the most pious couldn't ignore. In the wake of this existential crisis, the church's PR took a nosedive. Attendance dwindled, and with it, the hefty tithes that kept the ecclesiastical machine well-oiled. The seeds of the Reformation were being planted, though it would take a few more centuries for them to fully sprout. And then there were the flagellants. Oh yes, your neighbor has gone full zealot, whipping himself in public displays of piety. Flagellants believed that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and their extreme penance was an attempt to appease a wrathful deity. They'd parade through towns, whipping themselves bloody, convinced that their suffering would spare others. Today, you'd probably call it a PR stunt gone wrong, but back then, it was a sincere, if misguided, attempt to turn the tide of divine judgment. But while they were busy flogging themselves, the powers that be were less than impressed. The church, already struggling to maintain control, saw the flagellants as an unruly mob threatening to upend what little order remained. The authorities cracked down on these self-styled martyrs, but not before their fervor had spread, leaving a trail of confusion and a few less than pleasant stains on the cobblestones. So, there you are, feasting on your medieval lunch, while the world around you changes faster than you can say, bubonic. You're living through a pivotal moment in history, where the old order is dying as surely as those afflicted by the plague. The societal upheaval ushered in by the Black Death isn't just a footnote in history. It's the prologue to modernity, setting the stage for a new world where the rules of power, labor, and gender are rewritten. But don't pack up your turnips just yet. There's more to come. The Black Death's legacy is sprawling, and as we dig deeper, we'll uncover how these changes reverberated through centuries, shaping the world we know today. So stick around. There's still plenty of medieval madness to unravel, and who knows what strange twists history has in store. So, as you gnaw on that medieval lunch of dubious freshness, let's dive into the political kaleidoscope the Black Death spun across Europe. If you thought the social upheaval was chaotic, you haven't seen anything yet. The plague wasn't just a health crisis. It was a wrecking ball smashing through the carefully crafted Jenga tower of medieval politics. Thrones were toppling faster than knights at a jousting tournament, and the power dynamics were shifting like the sands of the Sahara. First off, let's talk about monarchies. If you were a king or queen, the Black Death was like a particularly lethal game of musical chairs. The plague didn't care about your royal blood or your fancy titles. It was an equal opportunity destroyer. Consider England's King Edward Roman III. In 1348, the Black Death waltzed into his court and claimed his beloved daughter, Joan, and a slew of his courtiers. It was like a medieval version of a disaster movie, with the royal court as the unwilling cast. And Edward wasn't alone. Across Europe, rulers were losing heirs faster than you could say divine right, a term that suddenly seemed up for debate. Succession crises became the political fashion statement of the day. Picture this. You're a noble family, and your heir has just succumbed to the plague. Now, you're scrambling to figure out who's going to inherit the family estate, while keeping a wary eye on your opportunistic neighbors. It was a bit like a medieval soap opera, with more plague and fewer plot twists. The Black Death didn't just take lives. It took stability, leaving behind a political landscape that looked like a game of Risk gone horribly wrong. In France, the situation was equally grim. King Philip VI faced not only the plague, but also the ongoing 100 Years' War with England. Talk about a bad day at the office. As if losing battles wasn't enough, the plague decimated his army, making an already dire situation even worse. The Black Death was the ultimate unwanted guest, showing up uninvited and overstaying its welcome. It didn't just destabilize kingdoms, it upended entire political strategies. But let's not forget the ripple effects. The loss of so many lives led to a vacuum of power. In some regions, local lords found themselves suddenly thrust into positions of authority as their superiors succumbed to the disease. It was like being promoted not because you were the best candidate, but because you were the last one standing. Overnight, the political landscape became a game of thrones, one where survival was the only qualification needed. Now, you might be wondering how governance managed to chug along amidst this chaos. Well, the answer is surprisingly practical. Legal changes swept across the land as governments scrambled to adapt. Labor laws, for instance, saw a complete overhaul. The Statute of Laborers in 1351, enacted by Edward Roman III, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, effectively trying to stop the economic tidal wave the Black Death unleashed. Of course, this was about as effective as trying to catch a dragon with a butterfly net. Labor was scarce, and workers were in the driver's seat, demanding, and often receiving, better terms. And here's where it gets interesting. These changes weren't just about economics, they represented a shift in power dynamics. For the first time, the laboring class had a voice, even if it was just a whisper. The statute was a desperate attempt by the nobility to cling to their old ways, but it also acknowledged a new reality. The world was changing, and the serfs were no longer content to live as they had before. So, while the statute sought to maintain the status quo, it inadvertently highlighted the cracks in the feudal system. Speaking of cracks, let's debunk the myth of the doomsday atmosphere. Sure, the plague was catastrophic, but people didn't just sit around waiting for the world to end. They adapted. They survived. The reality was a lot less apocalyptic and a lot more practical. People got on with life, because what else were they supposed to do? The grim adjustments they made were less about resignation and more about resilience. Take, for example, the shift in agricultural practices. With fewer hands to work the land, innovations became necessary. The three-field system, which had been used for centuries, evolved as farmers sought more efficient methods. Crop rotation and new techniques gained traction, not because people suddenly became agricultural geniuses, but because necessity is the mother of invention. It wasn't about embracing a new dawn. It was about surviving until the next harvest. And then there's urban planning. Cities, those medieval petri dishes of disease, had to rethink their layouts. Public health measures, primitive by today's standards, began to emerge. Quarantines, though rudimentary, became common practice. In Venice, officials established the first lazarettos, quarantine stations for maritime travelers. These weren't born from a sudden burst of civic pride, but from the stark reality that the Black Death had no respect for borders or social standing. As the day wears on, you can't help but marvel at the sheer adaptability of humans in the face of adversity. The Black Death was a crucible, forging new social and political orders from the ashes of the old. But don't get too comfortable. The story of this pandemic is far from over. There are still more threads to untangle, more myths to bust, and more truths to uncover. So hold onto your medieval hat. There's more historical madness to explore as we journey deeper into the aftermath of the Black Death. Stay tuned, because tomorrow the plot only thickens. As the sun dips below the horizon and casts the medieval landscape in hues of orange and purple, it's time to reflect on how this catastrophic era paved the way for something remarkably unexpected, the Renaissance. Picture the plague as history's most morbid midwife, ushering in a rebirth of culture and thought. The Black Death wasn't just a tragic chapter. It was the prelude to a new epoch where humanism and innovation would take center stage, leaving behind the gory remnants of medieval despair. Now, let's talk about how the Black Death laid the foundation for this cultural renaissance. First off, there was money, lots of it, floating around in the pockets of survivors. When nearly a third of Europe's population vanishes, resources and wealth redistribute in surprising ways. With fewer mouths to feed and less competition, those who survived found themselves wealthier, or at least less poor. The sudden availability of land and increased wages were like hitting a socio-economic jackpot. This newfound prosperity allowed families to invest in education and the arts rather than just scraping by. And when people aren't entirely preoccupied with survival, creativity tends to flourish. This shift in economic fortunes was accompanied by an equally important shift in perspective. Humanism, the grim reality of the plague, forced people to reconsider their place in the universe. This wasn't about divine punishment anymore. It was about human potential and resilience. Enter the Renaissance, with its emphasis on classical knowledge, individual achievement, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, humans were capable of extraordinary things without divine intervention. It was like waking up from a long, dark medieval dream to discover a world bursting with color and possibility. In cities like Florence, this newfound vibrancy translated into an explosion of art and culture. Patrons like the Medici family, swimming in wealth thanks to the economic upheaval, funneled money into artistic endeavors. The result, masterpieces that would define Western art for centuries. Without the plague shaking things up, we might never have seen the likes of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, or Botticelli. History's greatest pandemic had unwittingly set the stage for a flourishing of creativity that would redefine what it meant to be human. But let's not get too swept up in the romance of Renaissance art without acknowledging the harsh realities that made it possible. Remember, this was a time when the world had been so profoundly altered that people were forced to innovate or perish. The printing press, invented a few decades after the plague, democratized knowledge in a way that was once unimaginable. It was one of those delightful unintended consequences, like discovering penicillin in a moldy Petri dish. Suddenly, ideas could spread as fast as the plague once had, but this time with far more positive results. Speaking of spreading ideas, let's bust the myth of the medieval end of the world mentality. Sure, the Black Death felt apocalyptic, but humanity didn't just curl up in a collective fetal position. People adapted, rebuilt, and moved forward. The notion that the medieval mind was fixated on doomsday is as much a myth as unicorns prancing in the English countryside. In reality, the resilience and ingenuity of the survivors laid the groundwork for a more connected and forward-thinking Europe. They didn't wait for the world to end. They went out and created a new one. And what about those who claim the Black Death was a force of pure destruction? Yes, it was cataclysmic, but also catalytic. It challenged feudal hierarchies, forced technological and agricultural innovation, and sparked philosophical debates that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment. The aftermath of the plague is proof that out of chaos comes creativity, and from destruction comes a chance for renewal. It's a lesson in resilience that echoes down through the centuries, reminding us that even in the darkest times, there's room for growth. As evening settles in, and you find yourself pondering the legacy of the Black Death, take a moment to appreciate the irony of history. A microscopic bacterium, spread by fleas riding rats, set off a chain reaction that led to some of the most profound changes in human society. It's a testament to the unpredictable nature of history and the tenacity of the human spirit. The Black Death didn't just end lives, it transformed them, setting humanity on a course toward modernity. So, what can we learn from this dive into history's greatest pandemic? First, that human resilience is nothing short of extraordinary. Second, that sometimes it takes a crisis to shake us from complacency and force innovation. And finally, that in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit is remarkably difficult to extinguish. The Black Death was not just a period of suffering. It was a turning point, a grim yet essential chapter that set the stage for the world we know today. As you digest these thoughts, along with whatever medieval snack you've salvaged, you might wonder why this story still matters. Well, history isn't just a series of dates and events. It's a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. The Black Death shows us that while we may be fragile creatures, we're also capable of rebuilding, reimagining, and rising from the ashes. And if that's not a lesson worth remembering, then what is? So, as you close this chapter of medieval history, remember that even in the darkest times, there's light at the end of the tunnel. The Renaissance was more than just a period of artistic rebirth. It was the culmination of humanity's ability to adapt and thrive in the face of adversity. It's a story of survival, transformation, and the enduring power of the human spirit. And who knows, maybe the next time you're faced with a challenge, you'll find a little inspiration in the unlikely legacy of the Black Death. In a city where fortunes were built on the backs of bleeding woolly creatures, the Medici family started their ascent not with a bang, but with a bale. Florence in the 14th century was a bustling hub of commerce, where merchants and bankers were the rock stars of the day, minus the guitar solos and pyrotechnics. You had your guilds, you had your trade routes, and you had your ambitious families like the Medici, who saw not just wool, but the potential to weave themselves into the very fabric of history. Enter Giovanni di Bixi de Medici, the man with a plan and probably a very convincing sales pitch. Giovanni wasn't content to simply count coins. He wanted to make them multiply like rabbits. He turned the Medici Bank into a money-making machine that would make modern hedge fund managers green with envy. How did he do this? By understanding that in Florence, the only thing more powerful than money was the church. And if you could make yourself indispensable to the Pope, well, you just found yourself a golden ticket to the top of the social food chain. By the time Giovanni got his hands on the family business, around 1397, Florence was an economic powerhouse, the kind of place where fortunes could be made overnight if you played your cards right. And Giovanni knew how to deal those cards. His big break came when he managed to secure the job of managing the finances of the Pope himself. It was like being the papal PayPal, except with a lot more gold and a lot less digital security. The church, always in need of funds for this basilica or that crusade, found the Medici Bank's services indispensable. In return, the Medici got the kind of political clout that was worth more than gold. Speaking of gold, let's talk numbers. The Medici Bank wasn't your average piggy bank. By the early 15th century, they were handling sums that would make even today's Wall Street titans do a double take. We're talking about loans and deposits in the hundreds of thousands of florins, an amount that could fund entire armies or build massive cathedrals. And it wasn't just the sheer volume of money that was impressive. It was how the Medici managed to keep it all in circulation, pulling strings behind the scenes like puppet masters of the Florentine economy. Giovanni's knack for financial wizardry was matched only by his ability to navigate the complex web of Florentine politics. He wasn't just a banker. He was a strategist who knew when to pull back and when to push forward. He understood that power wasn't just about wealth, but about influence, about having the ear of the right people at the right time. When the Pope needed funds, Giovanni was there with a loan. When a political rival needed to be outmaneuvered, Giovanni was 3 steps ahead. He played the long game, and it paid off handsomely. But let's not romanticize Giovanni as some kind of benevolent banker with a heart of gold. This was a man who understood the power dynamics of his time and wasn't afraid to exploit them. He saw the church as both a client and a means to an end, and he used his position to advance the Medici family's status in Florence and beyond. This wasn't altruism. This was savvy business acumen wrapped in a cloak of piety, and it worked. By the time Giovanni passed the baton to his sons, the Medici were poised to become one of the most influential families in Europe. So what's the takeaway here? The Medici didn't just ride the wave of the Renaissance. They helped create it. They transformed their humble beginnings into a financial empire that would fund some of the greatest artistic achievements of the era. And it all started with Giovanni, a man who saw opportunity in every transaction and knew that the real power was in knowing how to use it. The Medici story is one of ambition, cunning, and a touch of audacity, a tale as rich and textured as the tapestries that adorned their palaces. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Medici has only just begun. As the baton of ambition passed from Giovanni to his son Cosimo de' Medici, Florence was about to witness a masterclass in the art of subtle dominance. Cosimo, often dubbed the godfather of the Renaissance, didn't need a fedora or a horse head in the bed to get his point across. No, Cosimo wielded influence like a Renaissance maestro, conducting an orchestra of power, art, and politics. Picture Florence as a grand stage, and Cosimo as the stealthy director pulling strings from the shadows, his fingers in every pie and his eyes on every player. But let's cut through the romantic fog and get down to brass tacks. Cosimo's rise was less about poetic vision and more about pragmatic maneuvering. He understood that real power lay in being the invisible hand, guiding the visible puppets. So, how did Cosimo manage to become Florence's puppet master without ever officially ruling? Well, my friends, it all came down to a little thing called money, and a knack for playing the game better than anyone else. Cosimo was a man who knew the power of the purse. By the time he took over the family business, the Medici Bank was already a financial juggernaut. handling sums that could make a modern-day billionaire blink. We're talking about assets totaling in the millions of florins, enough to buy influence, commission masterpieces, and if needed, grease the palms of any pesky political rivals. Cosimo understood that in Florence, as in today's world, cash was king and art was its queen. His patronage of the arts was not merely about aesthetic appreciation. It was a strategic investment in cultural capital. Take Filippo Brunelleschi, for instance, a man with a vision as grand as the dome he eventually built for the Florence Cathedral. While others saw a madman with wild architectural plans, Cosimo saw a golden opportunity. By funding Brunelleschi's projects, Cosimo wasn't just financing art, he was cementing his family's legacy in stone. The dome itself, completed in 1436, was a marvel of engineering, a literal crowning glory that put Florence, and the Medici name, on the map. Then there was Donatello, the sculptor whose works seemed to breathe with a life of their own. Under Cosimo's patronage, Donatello created the iconic bronze David, a piece so revolutionary it practically screamed Renaissance to anyone within earshot. But for Cosimo, it wasn't just about the beauty of the piece, it was about the messages it sent. Investing in artists like Donatello was a way to showcase Medici power and sophistication, a Renaissance-era version of social media branding. Imagine if Instagram had existed back then. Cosimo's feed would have been an art historian's dream. But let's not kid ourselves. Cosimo's love for art had a calculating edge. Each commission was a carefully considered step in a larger game of social chess. By aligning the Medici name with groundbreaking art and architecture, Cosimo was constructing a narrative of cultural supremacy. It was as if he was saying, "Look at what we can create. Look at what we can do. Now imagine what we can do for you." A lesson in influence that modern-day influencers, with their brand partnerships and curated aesthetics, could certainly appreciate. Yet, for all his finesse, Cosimo's path wasn't without its bumps. Political rivals were aplenty, and the Albizzi family, in particular, was a thorn in his side. In 1433, Cosimo found himself on the wrong end of an exile order, forced to pack his bags and leave Florence for a year. It's a classic case of you can't keep a good man down, because Cosimo used his time away to build alliances, returning to Florence with more power and influence than he had before. Exile, more like a networking opportunity. Back in the city, Cosimo picked up right where he left off, weaving a web of influence that stretched across Europe. His bank was the financial lifeline for the papacy, and his political savvy ensured that Florence remained a beacon of stability, or as stable as a city of intrigue and ambition could be. Cosimo's ability to balance these competing interests was nothing short of masterful. He was the ultimate Renaissance multitasker, juggling art, politics, and finance with an ease that was almost infuriating in its brilliance. But let's not pretend this was some idyllic fairy tale. The Medici's grip on Florence was as much about coercion as it was about culture. Cosimo's philanthropy often came with strings attached, and those who dared to snip those strings found themselves outmaneuvered or outcast. It was a delicate dance of power, one that required constant vigilance and a willingness to make hard decisions. Cosimo understood that the true power wasn't in the title, but in the ability to influence those who held it. As the 15th century marched on, Cosimo's influence only grew. His patronage had transformed Florence into a cultural powerhouse, a city where art and politics intertwined like vines on a trellis. It was a place where artists and thinkers found fertile ground, and where the Medici name became synonymous with the Renaissance itself. But make no mistake, this was no altruistic endeavor. It was a calculated strategy of power through culture, a legacy that would echo through the halls of history long after Cosimo was gone. And so, as we leave Cosimo plotting his next move, remember this: the Medici were not just patrons of the arts, they were architects of power. Their story is one of ambition and cunning, a reminder that history is as much about those who pull the strings as it is about those who dance to their tune. Stay tuned, because the Medici saga is far from over, and the next act promises to be just as intriguing as the last. As the Medici saga unfolds, we find ourselves face to face with Lorenzo de Medici, a man who could charm the sarks off a statue. Dubbed Lorenzo the Magnificent, and not just because it rolls off the tongue like a Renaissance rap lyric. He was the kind of leader who balanced chaos and charisma like a juggler with too many balls in the air. Lorenzo didn't just rule Florence. He practically invented the Renaissance-era hype man persona. He was a diplomat, a patron of the arts, and a guy who managed to keep his head in a city where losing it was almost a civic pastime. Let's talk about Lorenzo's cultural contributions. If Cosimo laid the foundations of the Medici legacy, Lorenzo built the palatial estates of influence on top of it. Under his wing, Florence became the beating heart of Renaissance art and culture. While Michelangelo carved his way into immortality, and Leonardo da Vinci was busy sketching things that looked like an engineer's fever dream, Lorenzo was there, pulling strings and writing checks. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't altruism wrapped in a doublet and hose. Lorenzo understood that art was power, and cultural capital was the currency that could buy you a legacy more enduring than any gold flooring. Yet, it wasn't all frescoes and festivals. The realm of Renaissance politics was a minefield, and Lorenzo danced through it with the grace of a cat on a hot tin roof. Cue the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, a plot that could have been scripted by a medieval Monty Python. The Pazzi family, egged on by papal and rival family grudges, decided that the best way to resolve their issues with the Medici was a good old-fashioned assassination. Picture this: an Easter Sunday service at the cathedral, a perfect setting for some divine intervention, literally. The plan: take out Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano in one fell swoop. The reality: more like a comedy of errors. As the plot unfolded, Giuliano was fatally stabbed, but Lorenzo managed to escape, bleeding yet alive, into safety. Picture a scene where instead of hushed churchgoers, you have chaos echoing off the walls of the cathedral. The conspirators had underestimated the Medici influence and overestimated their own abilities. Lorenzo's swift response was nothing short of Machiavellian genius. With a mix of public outrage and strategic retribution, he rallied the Florentines, turning the botched plot into a rallying cry. The surviving conspirators met their ends in a variety of unpleasant ways, proving that if you come at the king, you better not miss, especially if that king's name is Lorenzo. But Lorenzo wasn't just about quashing conspiracies and sponsoring frescoes. He was a master of diplomacy, a Renaissance VIP who knew how to work a room or an entire continent. Take the Peace of Lodi in 1454, which set the stage for a rare period of relative peace in Italy. Lorenzo wasn't directly responsible for this treaty, but he certainly knew how to keep it going. His diplomatic finesse was the stuff of legend, managing to keep the fractious Italian states from each other's throats, and instead focused on more productive endeavors, like buying art or building basilicas. Lorenzo's knack for alliances extended beyond treaties and into the realms of marriage and social maneuvering. His daughter, Maddalena, was married off to the Pope's nephew, a move that was less about romance and more about securing papal favor. A Renaissance Tinder match with geopolitical implications. Lorenzo's diplomatic web was complex, stretching across Europe and ensuring that Florence remained a cultural and political powerhouse. Now, let's break down Lorenzo's economic strategy. The Medici Bank, while still a behemoth, was beginning to face headwinds, and Lorenzo's flamboyant spending didn't help. Picture an opulent banquet where the guest list includes the who's who of Renaissance Florence, all funded by the Medici coffers. Lorenzo's belief in art and culture was as deep as the pockets he sometimes emptied, and while his spending spree did wonders for Florence's artistic reputation, it left the family's finances in a precarious state. Here's the kicker. Lorenzo knew this, yet he continued, because in his mind, the cultural capital was worth any financial risk. And speaking of risks, Lorenzo's reign was not without its share of conflicts. The War of the Pazzi conspiracy aftermath saw Florence pitted against the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples. Yet, even in the throes of war, Lorenzo's diplomatic skills shone. He personally traveled to Naples in 1479 to negotiate peace with King Ferdinand I, a move that was as audacious as it was successful. This wasn't just diplomacy. It was a masterclass in Renaissance crisis management, a reminder that in the Game of Thrones, sometimes a personal touch can accomplish what armies cannot. Lorenzo's life was a tapestry woven with threads of culture, politics, and power, each strand telling a story of its own. Yet, for all his magnificence, Lorenzo was a man of his time, navigating a world of shifting alliances and turbulent politics with a flair that was uniquely his own. He was both a product of his era and a shaper of it, embodying the spirit of the Renaissance in every sense of the word. As we leave Lorenzo, standing as a titan of culture amidst the swirling chaos of Italian politics, remember this: the Medici weren't just patrons, they were pioneers. They understood that power wasn't just about wealth or influence, it was about legacy. Lorenzo's reign marked a high point in the Medici saga, a period of artistic and political brilliance that would echo through history. But the Medici story is far from over, and the future promises more intrigue, drama, and perhaps a bit of Renaissance-style redemption. Stay tuned, because the next chapter in the Medici saga is waiting just around the corner. As Lorenzo's grand tapestry of power and art began to fray at the edges, it became clear that even the most magnificent of reigns can hang by a thread. The Medici, for all their flair and finance, were about to face a grim reality: economic missteps and external pressures that would send their carefully constructed empire into a tailspin. The Renaissance may have been their stage, but the world was about to hand them a script filled with drama and decline. Let's talk money, or rather, the lack of it. The Medici Bank, once the crown jewel of Florence's finances, had started to wobble like a drunken reveller at one of Lorenzo's legendary feasts. By the late 15th century, the bank's reserves had dwindled, thanks to a series of bad loans and risky ventures that would make even today's most daring venture capitalists wince. At the peak of their power, the Medici controlled assets worth millions of florins, but by the time Lorenzo had finished his Renaissance spending spree, the coffers were echoing like an empty cathedral. You see, Lorenzo, for all his magnificence, had a spending problem. His investment in art and culture was a double-edged sword. It secured his legacy, sure, but it also drained the family's finances faster than you could say Michelangelo. Picture Lorenzo as a 15th century rock star with a penchant for patronage instead of private jets. His lavish lifestyle and the constant funding of art projects were akin to setting fire to a pile of florins in the name of cultural glory. And while the art was priceless, price was very real. Then there were the French, a group not known for their subtlety when it came to Italian invasions. Charles Romanate of France decided that Italy was ripe for the taking, and in 1494 he marched his army into the peninsula with all the finesse of a bull in a china shop. Florence, caught in the crossfire, was forced to deal with the fallout. The Medici, already reeling from financial woes, found their political grasp slipping. Lorenzo's son, Piero de' Medici, tried to negotiate with Charles, but let's just say his diplomatic skills didn't quite live up to the family legacy. Picture Piero as a Renaissance-era deer caught in the French headlights. Piero's attempts at appeasement were nothing short of a disaster. He agreed to terms that were so generous to the French that the Florentines practically ran him out of town on a rail. It was a classic case of too little, too late, and with that, the Medici were exiled from Florence, their influence reduced to whispers in the corridors of power they once ruled. The city, once a Medici stronghold, now turned to the fiery sermons of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar with a flair for the dramatic and a disdain for the excesses of the Renaissance. Savonarola's rise was like a Renaissance reality show, complete with bonfires of vanities and a public eager for a scapegoat. But let's not kid ourselves. The Medici weren't just victims of external forces. They were architects of their own misfortune. The bank's collapse wasn't just due to Lorenzo's lavish spending. It was also a result of poor management and risky ventures. The London and Bruges branches of the Medici Bank were hemorrhaging money, with debts mounting faster than a painter's latest masterpiece. By 1499, the Medici Bank was essentially bankrupt, a financial disaster that would have made even the most reckless of Wall Street bankers shudder. Now, let's sprinkle in a few colorful characters from the later Medici generations who tried to pick up the pieces. Enter Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X, a man who believed that money was to be spent and not hoarded. His papal reign was marked by extravagance that would make a Kardashian blush. He famously quipped, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it he did, throwing lavish parties and commissioning opulent projects, which further drained the Vatican's finances. Giovanni was like a Renaissance party planner with a penchant for papal finery, and his indulgence laid the groundwork for a little thing called the Protestant Reformation. Then there's Giulio de Medici, who became Pope Clement Roman VII. If Giovanni was the Medici party pope, Giulio was the Medici crisis pope. His papacy was one of chaos, marked by the sack of Rome in 1527, a low point that saw the Eternal City pillaged by mutinous troops. Clement's inability to navigate the turbulent waters of European politics left the Medici name tarnished, like a once gilded fresco now peeling under the weight of time and neglect. But don't count the Medici out just yet. Even as they faced economic ruin and political exile, their story was far from over. The family's ability to adapt and reinvent themselves was as much a part of their legacy as any commissioned artwork. While the early 16th century was a rough patch, the Medici had a knack for bouncing back, and the seeds of their resurgence were already being sown. As the Medici saga teeters on the edge of chaos, remember this. History isn't just about the rise and fall. It's about the resilience and reinvention that follows. The Medici may have stumbled, but their story was far from finished. The next chapter promised a return to power, a testament to their enduring influence and adaptability in the face of adversity. So, stay tuned, because there's more intrigue, drama, and perhaps a touch of redemption waiting in the wings. The Medici weren't just patrons of the arts. They were masters of the comeback. As the Medici story teetered on the precipice of chaos, we find the seeds of their resurgence being sown with the tenacity of a gardener planting tulips during a hurricane. The Medici, for all their opulent excess and political missteps, were nothing if not resilient. Like a cat with 9 lives, or maybe even more, given their knack for bouncing back, they weren't about to vanish into history's shadows just yet. Enter Cosimo I de Medici, man with a vision as wide as the Arno River and ambitions even grander. We're talking about a guy who, despite not being in the direct line of succession, managed to grab the reins of Florence in 1537 at the tender age of 17. Imagine a teenager today trying to rule over a city-state while navigating acne and algebra. Yet, Cosimo was no ordinary teen. He was a political prodigy with a talent for both leadership and, shall we say, selective ruthlessness. Cosimo knew he had to do more than just sit pretty. He had to cement the Medici legacy in stone, literally and figuratively. His reign saw the completion of the Uffizi Gallery, initially intended as offices for Florentine magistrates, but now home to some of the world's most cherished art collections. And speaking of art, Cosimo knew the value of a good PR campaign. By the time he was done, Michelangelo and Botticelli were practically household names, and Florence was once again the glittering jewel in Italy's crown. But let's not pretend Cosimo was just a benevolent art lover. His political maneuverings were as intricate as a Florentine lace collar. Take, for instance, his consolidation of power by marrying Eleonora di Toledo, a Spanish noblewoman whose dowry was the stuff of Renaissance dreams. This strategic alliance strengthened Medici ties with Spain, bringing both cash and cachet. It's like merging two corporate giants, only with more velvet. Cosimo's ambitions didn't stop at matrimonial mergers. He embarked on a series of military campaigns that expanded the Tuscan territory, turning Florence into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany by 1569, a title he secured from Pope Pius V. Cosimo knew that in the Game of Thrones, you either win or you end up as a footnote, and he was determined to write his own chapter. His military and political prowess garnered him the grand title of Cosimo I, Grand Duke of Tuscany, a testament to his ability to play the geopolitical chessboard like a grandmaster. Yet, with great power comes great paranoia. Cosimo's rule was marked by a ruthless efficiency that would make a mafia boss envious. He established a secret police force to sniff out enemies and rivals, ensuring that any whispers of dissent were silenced before they could become shouts. Imagine living in a city where Big Brother was the guy who also funded your favorite artist. It was a delicate balance between patronage and power, one that Cosimo managed with a deftness that belied his youth. Now, let's fast forward a bit to another Medici who left his mark on history, albeit in a different arena, Catherine de Medici. Arriving in France as a young bride, she was about to become one of history's most influential queens. Catherine's story is one of intrigue, political ballet, and a fair bit of poison, literally. As the queen consort turned regent, she navigated the treacherous waters of French politics with the grace of a swan and the cunning of a fox. Catherine's influence during the French wars of religion was nothing short of legendary, or notorious, depending on whom you ask. She was accused of orchestrating the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, where thousands of Huguenots were killed. While her exact role remains a subject of debate, the massacre underscored the brutal realities of power in a world where religious affiliation could mean life or death. Catherine's legacy is as complex as her character, a blend of diplomacy, ambition, and survival instincts that would make Machiavelli proud. The Medici weren't just shaping history, they were sculpting it, chiseling each generation's legacy into the marble of time. Their name became synonymous with the Renaissance, not merely for their patronage of the arts, but for their ability to bend the political landscape to their will. They were the original power players, the dynastic dynasty that set the stage for modern banking and cultural patronage as we know it today. Speaking of banking, let's not gloss over the Medici's contribution to modern finance. Their banking practices laid the groundwork for what would become today's complex financial systems. The Medici Bank pioneered the use of double-entry bookkeeping, a revolutionary system that allowed for more accurate financial records. It's the sort of thing that makes accountants weep with gratitude, even if it doesn't quite make for a thrilling Netflix series. The Medici's financial innovations were matched only by their flair for drama. They were the ultimate Renaissance influencers, long before social media was a glimmer in humanity's eye. Their patronage of the arts wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about branding, about ensuring that the Medici name was etched into history with the permanence of a Leonardo masterpiece. They understood that culture was currency, and they spent it lavishly to secure their legacy. But let's not sugarcoat it. The Medici were also masters of manipulation, and their story is as much about the power plays as it is about the patronage. They were as ruthless as they were refined, a family that could host a lavish banquet one day and orchestrate a political coup the next. Their legacy is a tapestry of brilliance and brutality, a reminder that history is often written by those who wield the pen and the sword. As we draw the final curtain on the Medici saga, let's take a step back and admire the sweeping panorama of their legacy. They didn't just bankroll the Renaissance. They were its architects, its engineers, and its patrons. They funded the art, commissioned the architecture, and shaped the culture that continues to captivate us centuries later. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of ambition and the complex dance between culture and control. In the end, the Medici weren't just a family. They were a force of nature, a whirlwind of art, politics, and finance that forever altered the course of history. Their legacy is both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a reminder that the line between genius and tyranny is often as thin as a Florentine gold leaf. So, as you drift off to sleep, let the Medici story remind you of the timeless dance of power and art, where every patron is a king, and every king is a patron. Sweet dreams, history buffs, and may your nights be filled with Renaissance wonders and the echoes of Medici magnificence. Julius Caesar's early life could be described as a mashup of Make Rome Great Again meets Keeping Up with the Julii. Born in 100 BCE, this guy wasn't just any baby with a fancy toga. He was practically a Roman Kardashian, coming from the patrician Julii family, who were big shots claiming descent from one goddess or another, Venus to be exact. Talk about having a divine excuse for good looks and ambition, but let's not get too starry-eyed just yet. When little Julius was born, Rome was a chaotic republic, more soap opera than political powerhouse. The Rome of Caesar's youth was as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Power struggles were as common as toga parties. The Senate was dominated by rich old dudes who made decisions like they were ordering off a menu, and the common folk, or plebs, were often left with scraps. In this political stew, young Julius was expected to make something of himself. And he did, just not in any way anyone expected. Here's a fun fact. Before he became the most famous Roman of all time, Caesar was a priest. Yes, you heard that right. Picture a young Caesar, not in armor but in priestly robes, serving as the Flame Diales, a high priest of Jupiter. It wasn't exactly the badass career move one might expect, But hey, it got him out of military service, and considering Rome's penchant for warfare, that was a win in its own right. The priesthood came with perks, like a nice house and a seat at the table of Roman elite functions. However, the role also had its quirks. For instance, he wasn't allowed to touch a horse or spend a night outside the city, which, let's face it, would cramp anyone's style. But Caesar's cushy priest gig hit a snag when Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Rome's dictator for life, or so he thought, started his notorious proscriptions. These were basically hit lists of political enemies, and guess what? Caesar's name was on it. At just 19, he was marked for death. Instead of panicking, Caesar did what any rational person would do. He ran. And here's where his audacious charm and quick thinking paid off. Caesar managed to charm and bribe his way out of trouble with Sulla's henchmen, convincing them to spare his life. Rumor has it that even Sulla acknowledged the potential threat Caesar posed, saying that in this boy there are many Mariuses. Marius, by the way, was a legendary Roman general and Caesar's uncle by marriage. Clearly, Sulla had a knack for sparring ambition. With his life on the line, Caesar had to think fast and act faster. He hightailed it to the relative safety of the East, where he served in the military and proved himself a capable leader. It was here that Caesar began to build his reputation, earning a civic crown for saving a fellow soldier. Not too shabby for a former priest. By 78 BCE, Sulla had kicked the bucket, and Caesar felt safe enough to return to Rome. But he wasn't coming back to blend in. He was coming back to take over. Now, back in Rome, the political landscape was like a game of musical chairs with daggers. Caesar had learned a thing or two about maneuvering through Roman society. He made strategic connections, married well, several times actually, and climbed the political ladder with the grace of a ballet dancer and the ferocity of a gladiator. His charm was legendary. He could convince a fish to climb a tree, and his oratory skills were second to none. Caesar's rise through the ranks wasn't just about sweet talk, though. It was about understanding Rome's pulse, knowing when to push and when to retreat. It was about leveraging his family connections without being a puppet. The Julii family, despite their patrician status, weren't exactly rolling in wealth, so Caesar had to hustle. He borrowed money like a college student with a credit card, betting on his future success to pay off the debts. And it worked, because when Caesar gambled, he gambled big. He became known for his populist tactics, aligning himself with the people rather than the Senate's crusty establishment. This approach earned him both love and loathing in equal measure. But he wasn't just a populist. He was a political chameleon. He could shift his stance to match the prevailing winds, a skill that proved invaluable in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. As Caesar climbed the political totem pole, he left a trail of rivals in his wake. Some were outmaneuvered, others outcharmed, and a few simply outlived. He wasn't above using less than honorable means to achieve his goals, but in a city where intrigue was as common as olive oil, who could blame him? Caesar's ability to combine charisma with cunning made him a force to be reckoned with. By the time he reached the position of quaestor, the first step on the ladder of Roman political offices, Caesar was already thinking several moves ahead. He understood the importance of image and public perception. He knew that in Rome, as in life, it wasn't just what you did, but how you were seen doing it. Caesar's early life was a masterclass in ambition, adaptability, and audacity. From dodging Sulla's deadly list to captivating the Roman masses, he was a man who thrived in the chaos of Rome's political theater. His rise was as much about timing and opportunity as it was about skill and strategy. And as he continued to ascend, it became clear that Julius Caesar wasn't just playing the game. He was rewriting the rules. So there we have it, the early life of Julius Caesar, a man who would go on to change the course of history. From priesthood to political powerhouse, his journey was anything but ordinary. As we unpack his story further, remember that behind every myth, behind every marble bust and grand statue, was a man who understood that to conquer Rome, you had to first conquer its heart. And Caesar, well, he was just getting started. And speaking of conquering hearts, let's dive into Caesar's next big act, the conquest of Gaul. Gaul, the land of what is now roughly France and Belgium, back then was a patchwork quilt of tribes who probably wished they'd never heard the name Caesar. But for Rome, Gaul was like the ultimate all-you-can-conquer buffet, and Caesar was hungry. In 58 BCE, our man Julius was appointed governor of Cisalpine Gaul. Think of it as northern Italy's hip cousin. and he wasted no time in flexing those military muscles. His first move, a preemptive strike against the Helvetii, a tribe trying to relocate through Roman-held territory. Caesar claimed they were a threat, but honestly, it was more about showing who was boss. You see, Caesar knew that a good offense was the best defense, and more importantly, killer way to boost his clout back in Rome. The Gallic Wars spanned 8 years and were a masterclass in military strategy. Picture a chess game where Caesar was the grandmaster and the Gallic tribes were, well, playing checkers. He was outnumbered at times, but Caesar was nothing if not crafty. His army comprised roughly 50,000 Roman legionaries at its peak, tough, disciplined, and fiercely loyal. Meanwhile, the Gallic tribes, despite their brave warriors, were about as unified as a bag of cats. Economically, the conquests were a gold mine for Rome, literally. The spoils of war were immense. Gold, silver, and slaves poured into Roman coffers. Caesar himself acquired vast riches, helping him pay off those pesky debts. But let's not sugarcoat it. The human cost was staggering. By Caesar's own accounts, probably exaggerated because, hey, who doesn't like to inflate their stats? Over 1 million Gauls were killed or enslaved. It's as if Caesar was playing the role of a Roman superhero, but for the Gauls, he was more of a supervillain. Now, when it comes to propaganda, Caesar was the original spin doctor. He penned Commentarii de Bello Gallico, a third-person narrative of his exploits in Gaul. Think of it as a combination battle report and PR campaign. These writings made him a household name in Rome, painting him as a heroic figure bringing civilization to the wilds. Never mind that bringing civilization involved a lot of bloodshed and pillaging. Then there's the famous line, Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. It sounds like something you'd find in a self-help book or on a motivational poster, but it was reportedly Caesar's dispatch to the Senate after a swift victory at the Battle of Zela in 47 BCE. The truth, this battle was less about grand strategy and more of a mop-up operation against a minor king in modern-day Turkey. But why let facts get in the way of a good story? Caesar knew that brevity was the soul of wit, and apparently of propaganda. Caesar's military conquests were not just about land and loot, they were about legacy. He wanted to be remembered, not just as another Roman general, but as Rome's greatest. And he almost pulled it off. The Senate was uneasy with his growing power, but the people adored him. He was the people's hero, a man of action in a sea of stagnant senators. But his popularity was a double-edged gladius. His victories in Gaul made him a superstar, but they also set the stage for future conflicts. Let's not forget the economic engine driving this conquest train. Gaul's subjugation meant lucrative new territories for Rome, with fertile lands that were a godsend for Roman agriculture and trade. Caesar's campaigns opened up new roads and trade routes, integrating these lands into the Roman economy. Yet, beneath this veneer of prosperity lay the harsh reality of occupation, displacement, exploitation, and the imposition of Roman taxes. It was a classic case of who benefits, with Rome sitting pretty at the top. As we peel back the layers of Caesar's legend, it's clear that his story is more than just a tale of unstoppable ambition. It's a study in power, how to gain it, wield it, and eventually how it can consume. Caesar's brilliance lay in his ability to see beyond the battlefield, to understand how victories could be leveraged into political power. His was a mind that never stopped calculating, never stopped moving. The Gallic Wars also exposed the fragility of alliances and the fickleness of fortune. Caesar's success was built on a foundation of shifting sands. Loyalty was bought, survival was precarious, and power was always just one misstep away from crumbling. Yet, if the Gauls taught him anything, it was resilience, that, and the importance of having a plan B, C, and probably D. So, as we wrap up this chapter of Caesar's story, let's leave him standing triumphant over Gaul. He's on top of the world, or at least the western part of it. But in the back alleys of Rome, whispers of Dictator are starting to swirl, and not everyone is thrilled with Caesar's growing shadow. Stay tuned, because the next act is about to get even more dramatic. And speaking of dramatic, let's dive into the political soap opera that was the first triumvirate. Picture this. It's the late 60s BCE, and Rome is buzzing like a beehive with ambition, greed, and the occasional assassination. Enter Julius Caesar, fresh off his victorious Gallic tour, ready to strut his stuff on the political catwalk. But even Caesar, with his God-tier charisma, knew that conquering Rome wasn't a solo gig. He needed a squad, and not just any squad. He needed the Roman version of the Avengers, minus the spandex. Enter Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey to his friends and frenemies. Pompey was the dude with the credentials, a celebrated general with a string of victories in the East that made him a big deal in Rome. If Caesar was the ambitious up-and-comer, Pompey was the established star, the Roman equivalent of an A-list celebrity. And then there's Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, rumored to be able to buy the Colosseum and still have change left for a toga. He wasn't just rich, he was filthy rich, thanks to his shrewd real estate dealings and his less-than-savory habit of profiting from Rome's frequent fires. It said he owned the first Roman fire brigade, which conveniently only saved properties he owned. Talk about a business model. Together, these three formed the first triumvirate in 60 BCE, an unofficial pact that was more of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours arrangement. Think of it as a political power trio where each member had something the others needed. Caesar had the street cred with the people, Pompey had the military chops, and Crassus had the cash to fund their ambitions. It was a match made in Roman heaven, at least for a while. But here's the kicker. The triumvirate wasn't exactly public knowledge. It was more of a behind-the-scenes handshake deal, the kind of backroom agreement you'd expect from politicians who prefer their power plays served with a side of secrecy. And why not? The Roman Senate was already jittery with Caesar's rising star, and a formal alliance of these bigwigs would have sent them into a full-blown panic. The Senate, those crusty old patricians who fancied themselves the guardians of Rome's republic, weren't thrilled about this new power block. They saw Caesar's growing influence as a threat to the status quo, and they weren't wrong. The truth is, the Roman Republic was about as stable as a politician's promise, and the Senate's hold on power was slipping through their fingers like sand in a sieve. But let's be real. The Senate wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests. They were out of touch, more interested in preserving their privileges than addressing the needs of the average Roman. And into this mix came Caesar, with his populist flair and knack for making complex political maneuvers look like a stroll in the forum. The triumvirate's first big play was to get Caesar elected as consul in 59 BCE. Consuls were the highest elected officials in Rome, and being one was like being the president and prime minister rolled into one, with a dash of celebrity chef for good measure. With the consulship in his pocket, Caesar could push through legislation that benefited his allies. Pompey got his land settlements for veterans approved, Crassus got favorable tax reforms, and Caesar got a governorship in Gaul, which was basically a license to print military glory. But here's where things get juicy. These gentlemen weren't exactly BFFs. Their alliance was more of a frenemy situation, a delicate balance of mutual interests that could tip into chaos at any moment. Crassus and Pompey had a history of rivalry, dating back to their joint consulship in 70 BCE, where they'd barely managed to keep from throttling each other. Caesar, ever the diplomat, played the role of mediator, juggling their egos with the skill of a circus performer. Yet, like all great dramas, the triumvirate was doomed to crumble. Cracks started to show, and Crassus decided to seek his own military glory in Parthia, modern-day Iran, in 53 BCE. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. Crassus was defeated and killed at the Battle of Carrhae, a humiliating loss that left his head on a pike and his ambitions in tatters. With Crassus out of the picture, the tenuous balance between Caesar and Pompey began to unravel faster than a Roman toga in a windstorm. Without Crassus to play the middleman, Pompey started to drift towards the Senate's camp. He was awarded sole consulship in 52 BCE, a move that made him the establishment's golden boy, a far cry from his earlier populist days. Meanwhile, Caesar was still in Gaul, racking up victories, but also racking up power, and the Senate was getting twitchier by the day. They feared Caesar's return to Rome would spell the end of their influence. And who could blame them? The last time a Roman general had crossed the Rubicon River with an army, it hadn't exactly been a peaceful homecoming. In 49 BCE, the Senate, playing their final card, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a classic political move. Undermine your opponent by stripping them of their power base. But Caesar wasn't about to fold. On January 10th, 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon, a small stream with big consequences, famously declaring, Alia iacta est, the die is cast. It was the point of no return, the moment Caesar chose civil war over surrender. This act of defiance was a masterstroke of political theatre. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar wasn't just marching on Rome. He was gambling his future on a single roll of the dice. It was a bold move, but then again, bold was Caesar's middle name. The Senate's worst fears were realized. Caesar was coming, and he wasn't coming quietly. The first triumvirate, once the epitome of Roman political collaboration, was now a relic of history. With Crassus dead and Pompey aligning with the Senate, Caesar stood alone against the establishment. The stage was set for a showdown, a clash of titans that would reshape the Roman world. As the Senate scrambled to respond, Caesar advanced with his legions, sparking a civil war that would pit Roman against Roman. The stakes were nothing less than the future of Rome itself. Would Caesar triumph and reshape the Republic in his image, or would the Senate manage to preserve their power? Stay tuned, because this saga is far from over. We're just getting warmed up, and the next act promises to be a whirlwind of ambition, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of power. Caesar may have crossed the Rubicon. The journey from Republic to Empire was just beginning. With Caesar's audacious crossing of the Rubicon, Rome was on a collision course with destiny, primed for a showdown that promised more drama than a season finale of your favorite binge-worthy series. The man himself wasn't just marching towards Rome. He was swaggering, his legions in tow, ready to shake the pillars of the Republic to its very core. As Caesar advanced, Pompey and the Senate fled Rome like cats caught in them, scurrying to Greece to regroup and plot their comeback. Caesar, ever the opportunist, swept into the city and was declared dictator, temporarily, of course. You know, just long enough to restore order. This was 49 BCE, and the term was officially for a year, but let's be honest. Caesar wasn't the type to stick to expiration dates. His reforms came fast and furiously, like a blitz of legislative fireworks. He tackled debt, reformed the calendar, and even expanded the Senate, packing it with loyalists faster than you can say political maneuvering. The Julian calendar, by the way, was a masterstroke, finally aligning the Roman year with the solar cycle, which meant people could plan their toga parties without worrying if they'd accidentally scheduled them in the middle of winter. But as beneficial as these changes were, they also sowed seeds of discord. The old guard, in particular, saw their influence slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Speaking of slipping, let's not gloss over Caesar's sense of fashion as a dictator. His penchant for wearing a laurel wreath was more than just a fashion statement. It was a Roman power move. The wreath symbolized victory, but it was also a nifty cover-up for his receding hairline, a touch of vanity that humanized the otherwise god-like figure. In this ancient game of thrones, image was everything, and Caesar knew how to play his part to perfection. Yet, for all his reforms and style points, not everyone was cheering. The Senate, those bastions of conservatism, were seething with resentment. To them, Caesar's actions smacked of kingship, a chilling reminder of Rome's past before it became a republic. A dictator for life was one toga away from being a monarch, and Romans weren't exactly fans of crowns. The discontent simmered until it boiled over on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, a date forever etched into the annals of betrayal. Led by Brutus, Cassius, and over 60 conspirators, the plot to save the Republic took shape, fueled by a cocktail of fear, pride, and a dash of misplaced idealism. They fancied themselves as liberators, but the reality was messier, like trying to untangle a bowl of spaghetti with a pair of chopsticks. Did they genuinely believe they were rescuing the Republic? Perhaps, but let's not kid ourselves. Personal grudges and power plays were as much a part of the equation as any high-minded ideals. Brutus, for instance, was a friend of Caesar, yet he was also a senator who saw the Republic slipping away. His involvement was the ultimate act of betrayal, like finding out your best friend was rooting for the other team all along. And so, on March 15th, Caesar met his fate at the hands of those he considered allies. The conspirators struck in the Senate House, stabbing him 23 times as he allegedly uttered, "Et tu, brute," words that have echoed through history, whether he said them or not. It's the kind of dramatic flair that makes for a great story, but the reality was likely less poetic and more brutal. In the aftermath, the conspirators expected to be hailed as heroes, but instead they found themselves facing the wrath of a populace that had adored Caesar. His assassination sparked riots. and soon the streets of Rome were as chaotic as a chariot race with no finish line. The republic they sought to save was unraveling, and the power vacuum left by Caesar's death was about to plunge Rome into further turmoil. As we leave this chapter, the echoes of the Ides of March still reverberate. Julius Caesar, the man who reshaped Rome and dared to defy the very fabric of the republic, was gone. But his legacy, oh, that was just getting started. The stage was set for a new act, one where the battle lines would be drawn not just for power, but for the soul of Rome itself. Stay tuned as we dive into the fallout, where ambition, revenge, and the relentless tide of history would shape the next chapter of this epic saga. So there he was, Julius Caesar, reduced from a living legend to a cold marble bust, leaving behind a Rome that was a political powder keg with a fuse already lit. The senators who orchestrated his assassination quickly discovered that stabbing the man was a lot easier than stabbing his legacy. Chaos was the new ruler of Rome, and the Senate, those old-school aristocrats who thought they'd saved the Republic, found themselves caught in the whirlwind of their own making. Spoiler alert, they didn't save a darn thing. In the immediate wake of Caesar's untimely departure, Rome was swimming in a sea of uncertainty. You could almost hear the sound of knives being sharpened in the back alleys. In this power vacuum, everyone and their toga-wearing uncle fancied themselves the next big thing. The Senate was scrambling to keep things together, but it was like trying to hold sand with a sieve. Enter stage right. Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and adopted son. Now, if you're thinking an 18-year-old couldn't possibly steer the ship of state, you'd be right. But Octavian was no ordinary teenager. He was Caesar's heir, and with that came expectations bigger than a Roman amphitheater. Octavian was not just a kid with a famous name. He was shrewd, ambitious, and about as underestimated as a Trojan horse. He swiftly allied himself with Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Together, they formed the second triumvirate in 43 BCE, a political ménage à trois with a 10-year shelf life. This triumvirate was official, unlike the backroom dealings of the first, and it came with a mandate to hunt down Caesar's assassins. The Roman streets ran red as they pursued justice, or vengeance, depending on who you asked. The triumvirate's rule was anything but peaceful. Antony and Octavian had all the camaraderie of cats in a sack. Their alliance was a marriage of convenience, not mutual admiration. The real fireworks began after they wiped out the conspirators at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. With Brutus and Cassius out of the picture, the boys were free to squabble over who got the bigger slice of Rome's pie. Antony took the east, Octavian got the west, and Lepidus, well, he got Africa, but was soon nudged aside like a third wheel on a bad date. Antony cozied up with Cleopatra in Egypt, a move that was both politically and romantically charged. Meanwhile, Octavian was back in Rome, polishing his image like a seasoned spin doctor. He painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman gone native with his Egyptian queen. The propaganda war was on, and Octavian played it like a maestro. By 31 BCE, tensions boiled over into the Battle of Actium, a naval showdown that saw Octavian emerge victorious. Antony and Cleopatra's defeat was as dramatic as any Shakespearean tragedy, culminating in their double suicides the following year. With Antony gone, Octavian was the last man standing. In 27 BCE, he was granted the title of Augustus, becoming Rome's first emperor. The Republic was ancient history, and the Roman Empire was born, a transformation as seismic as a tectonic shift. Augustus was savvy. He maintained the facade of republican institutions while holding the real power tightly in his grasp. The Senate still met, but they were more like a historical reenactment than an actual governing body. Augustus gave Rome stability and peace, Pax Romana they called it, and the empire expanded, its borders stretching from Britain to Egypt. The economy thrived, public works flourished, and Roman culture hit its stride. Augustus ruled for 41 years, longer than any Roman leader before him, and he did it with a mix of charm, ruthlessness, and political acumen. He was the architect of an empire, but in many ways he was also the executor of Caesar's vision. So, what about Caesar's legacy? Well, the guy left quite the mark. His name became synonymous with power itself. The title Caesar morphed into Kaiser in Germany and Tsar in Russia, showing that his influence stretched far beyond the grave. His life and death were a cautionary tale about the seductive allure of power and the perils of ambition. But let's face it, legends have a way of overshadowing the nitty-gritty details. Over time, Caesar became a larger-than-life figure, a hero to some and a tyrant to others. In modern times, saying someone has a Caesar complex might mean they're a bit too power-hungry, or maybe they're just really into salads. But beyond the cliches, Caesar's enduring appeal lies in the complexity of his character. He was a man of contradictions, a populist with patrician roots, a conqueror who also loved the arts, and a dictator who dreamed of reform. Caesar's story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's more like a mosaic, made up of tiny, colorful tiles that together form a picture that is as confusing as it is fascinating. He was a man who pushed boundaries, for better or worse, and in doing so, he reshaped the world in ways that still resonate today. So, as we wrap up this saga, let's raise a metaphorical chalice to Julius Caesar, the man who came, saw, and forever changed the game. His life might have ended in a flurry of daggers, but his legacy, that's immortal. Whether you see him as a hero or a villain, there's no denying he was one of history's true game-changers. And that, dear friends, is the real rub. In the end, we're all just players on this grand stage, trying to leave our own mark before the curtain falls. Long before the Roman Senate was a dignified assembly of toga-clad elites on marble benches, it was more a gathering of weathered old men who smelled like sheep and dirt. Back in the days around 509 BCE, these early senators were less concerned with political intrigue and more familiar with the muck of the fields. These were not your typical politicians. They were more like your grumpy grandpa, who always had a story about walking uphill both ways. The Roman Senate got its start in the early days of the Roman Republic. Now, don't let the word republic fool you into thinking this was a democratic utopia. It was more like an exclusive club where the membership card was a family name, not an election result. The Senate began as an advisory body, a sort of ancient think tank without the modern perks of PowerPoint presentations or catered lunches. The senators were picked from the patrician class, a fancy term for the Roman aristocracy, which was basically the ancient 1%. At the heart of these early political structures was the idea of shared governance. But let's be clear, shared here didn't mean everyone got a say. It meant the elite shared power with each other, leaving the average Roman citizen with about as much political influence as a fish in a desert. The Senate's role was to advise the consuls, the two top dogs of the Republic who were elected officials, but only if you had the right connections, of course. Think of the consuls as co-presidents, but ones who had to step down after a year. Talk about a short shelf life. Now, let's tackle some of those legendary tales that have been handed down like heirlooms. Everyone's heard the story of Romulus, Rome's mythical founder, who supposedly established the Senate along with the city itself. According to legend, Romulus created the Senate by picking 100 of the wisest and oldest men from Rome's earliest inhabitants, which sounds like a recipe for the world's first gerontocracy. But let's put on our myth-busting hats for a second. The reality, it's more likely that the Senate evolved gradually as Rome transformed from a monarchy to a republic. Romulus might be great for a bedtime story, but in historical terms, he's more marketing than fact. As for those early senators, they weren't sipping wine in marble atriums. They were probably more used to the smell of livestock than luxury. These were practical men, often landowners who knew the value of a good harvest and a strong back. They had a vested interest in Rome's success because their personal wealth was tied up in it. If Rome prospered, so did they. It was less about public service and more about protecting their assets. It's easy to romanticize the Senate as a bastion of wisdom and virtue, but let's not polish the marble too much. Early Roman politics were less about noble ideals and more about who could navigate the complex web of personal alliances and family connections. The Senate was a political playground for the elite, where they played games with the future of Rome while the common folks watched from the sidelines, probably wondering what all the fuss was about. In these formative years, the Senate was still finding its feet, a bit like a toddler learning to walk. It had influence, sure, but it was far from the legislative powerhouse it would become. The real power often lay with the consuls and the military leaders who could command legions of soldiers. The Senate's role was more advisory, like a board of directors giving the thumbs up or down to the CEO's latest brilliant idea. But even in these early days, the Senate had its moments of influence. It was the Senate that decided Rome's fate in times of crisis, like when to declare war or whether to negotiate peace. Think of them as the ultimate tiebreakers in Rome's political tennis match. Despite the lack of formal power, the Senate commanded respect through tradition and the collective weight of its members' prestige. They were the elders, after all, and in a society that valued age and experience, that counted for a lot. So, there you have the humble beginnings of the Roman Senate, a far cry from the polished institution it would become. It was a group of men who gathered not in grand halls, but probably in modest settings, discussing the affairs of a city that would one day rule an empire. These early senators might not have had the power to make laws, but they were laying the groundwork for a political system that would influence the world for centuries, and all without the need for fancy togas or grand speeches. Just a bunch of old guys with a vision, some land, and a lot of determination. And so, as these early senators shuffled out of their modest gathering spots, probably tracking mud and ambition in equal measure, the Roman Senate was on the cusp of a dramatic transformation. Fast forward a few centuries, and we find ourselves in the thick of the Roman Republic, a time when the Senate began flexing its muscles like a contestant on a Roman gladiator show. Gone were the days of casual advisory chats. This was the era of power plays and political maneuvering, where the Senate was anything but a passive participant in Rome's grand narrative. By the middle of the Republic, the Senate had evolved from a mere advisory body into a powerful institution, wielding influence over Rome's destiny like a seasoned poker player with a killer hand. It wasn't just a talking shop anymore. It was the engine room of Roman politics. The Senate's role in declaring war was a prime example of its newfound clout. Picture this: a room full of toga-clad senators debating whether to unleash Rome's military might on an unsuspecting neighbor. Decisions like these were not taken lightly, as they often meant the difference between expansion and annihilation. It was the Senate that gave the thumbs up or down on such matters, effectively holding the fate of entire populations in its hands. But war was just one of the Senate's many obsessions. It also had a penchant for budget approvals. You see, running an empire, even in its early days, required serious cash. The Senate controlled the purse strings, deciding how Rome's denarii would be spent. From funding military campaigns to public works like roads and aqueducts, the Senate's financial decisions shaped the Roman landscape, both literally and figuratively. And let's be honest, having the power to approve or deny funds was like having the keys to the kingdom. It was a ticket to influence that most senators weren't shy about using to their advantage. This love affair with power wasn't just a phase. It was more like a committed relationship, with all the drama you'd expect from such a high-stakes liaison. Take Caro the Elder, for example. A man so hooked on Roman tradition, he could have been the poster child for conservative values. Caro was known for his staunch opposition to the moral decay he perceived in Roman society, famously ending his speeches with the insistence that Carthage must be destroyed. His dedication to preserving the old ways made him both revered and reviled, a classic case of love him or hate him. But what Caro really demonstrated was the Senate's ability to influence public morality and policy, shaping Roman culture as much as its politics. And speaking of drama, let's not forget the scandalous laws that added a splash of intrigue to the Senate's proceedings. The Lex Claudia was a particularly juicy piece of legislation. Passed in 218 BCE, it prohibited senators from owning large cargo ships, a move aimed at curbing the growing influence of wealthy senators in the commercial sector. This law was like throwing a wrench into the plans of ambitious senators who saw trade as a way to bolster their fortunes. While some claimed it was a noble effort to keep politics and business separate, others saw it as a power play to limit the influence of up-and-coming senatorial families. The Lex Claudia was a stark reminder that, even in ancient Rome, politics was a game of strategy, complete with its own set of winners and losers. Now, let's tackle the age-old question. Does power corrupt, or does it just make for better party stories? The Senate's evolution suggests a bit of both. On the one hand, the concentration of power in the hands of a few undoubtedly led to corruption and the occasional scandal. But on the other hand, it also created a vibrant political scene full of bold moves and bigger-than-life personalities. Senators like Caro thrived in this environment, using their influence to steer Rome's course and occasionally to settle personal scores. The appeal of such power was undeniable, and the Senate's members knew how to leverage it. They weren't just lawmakers. They were power brokers, deal-makers, and at times outright schemers. Their ability to influence Rome's direction was as much about personal ambition as it was about public service. Yet despite the occasional misstep or scandal, the Senate remained a central pillar of Roman governance, a testament to its enduring allure and the skill of its members in navigating the treacherous waters of politics. As we leave this chapter of the Senate's history, it's clear that the Republic era was a time of both glory and grime. The Senate's growing influence brought with it new challenges and opportunities, transforming it from a dusty old council into a dynamic force that shaped the fate of the Republic. It was a period of grand ambitions and even grander schemes, where the line between public duty and personal gain was often blurred. But that's a tale for another day, as we continue to unravel the intricate web of power and politics that was the Roman Senate. Stay tuned for more as we delve deeper into this captivating saga. As the Roman Senate swaggered into the era of epic conquest, it was clear that expansion wasn't just about adding new territories to the map. It was about inflating egos to new heights. The Senate, now basking in the glow of its newfound clout, was like a kid in a candy store, unable to resist grabbing at every shiny opportunity for power and prestige. Their ambitions were as vast as the territories Rome sought to conquer, and why not? When you're riding high on the wave of military triumphs, humility isn't exactly the first thing on your mind. Enter the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, who burst onto the scene with all the subtlety of a juggernaut at a tea party. These two were the poster boys for reform, or at least that's what they'd have you believe. Tiberius Gracchus, the elder, kicked off the drama in 133 BCE with his radical land reform proposal. The idea: redistribute public land to Rome's poor citizens, effectively playing Robin Hood with real estate. The notion of land for the people was undoubtedly appealing to the masses who were, quite frankly, tired of watching the rich get richer while they were left scrounging for crumbs. But let's not get too starry-eyed about Tiberius's motives. Sure, he had a genuine concern for the plebeians, but there was also a hefty dose of self-interest. His land reforms would have shifted power away from the Senate's old guard, making him a hero to the common folk while scoring him some serious political capital. The Senate, predictably, was not amused. They saw Tiberius's reforms as a direct assault on their privileges and power, a move akin to telling a lion to go vegetarian. The backlash was swift and brutal. Tiberius's opponents weren't about to let this upstart undermine centuries of senatorial control. In a dramatic twist that would make any political thriller proud, Tiberius was clubbed to death by a mob of senators and their supporters, effectively turning the Senate into a literal killer of dreams. It was a harsh reminder of how violently protective the Senate could be of its power, demonstrating that in Roman politics the pen might be mighty, but the club was mightier still. Undeterred by his brother's grisly demise, Gaius Gracchus picked up the torch a few years later. He took his brother's reformist agenda and added a few more items to the menu, like reducing grain prices and extending citizenship to more Italians. Gaius was the kind of guy who could have revolutionized Rome had he not been a few centuries too early. Alas, his efforts met a similarly grim end. Declared an enemy of the state, Gaius was cornered by the Senate's goons and ultimately took his own life. The Gracchus brothers saga was a cautionary tale of idealism clashing with entrenched power, with the Senate emerging victorious, albeit with blood on its hands. Meanwhile, the economic landscape of Rome was undergoing seismic shifts. The Senate, ever the master of adaptation, was quick to see the potential of new trade routes and the influx of wealth from conquered territories. They weren't just senators. They were the original influencers, shaping everything from the market price of olive oil to the latest toga trends. As Rome's borders expanded, so did the opportunities for profit, and the Senate knew how to capitalize on this like pros. But let's not pretend the windfall from expansion was evenly spread. While senators and their allies lined their pockets with profits from new provinces, the average Roman soldier, fresh from the battlefields, returned home to find his farm in disrepair and his wallet none the fatter. The economic divide was as wide as the Roman roads that stretched across the empire, and the Senate's focus on wealth acquisition often came at the expense of social stability. The Senate's influence extended beyond economics. They shaped culture and fashion too. The toga, that iconic symbol of Roman citizenship, was more than just a garment. It was a statement piece, a visual reminder of one's status. Senators, ever conscious of their image, were trendsetters in their own right. They dictated the style du jour, ensuring that their sartorial choices were as sharp as their political maneuvering. If you were a senator, your toga wasn't just clothing. It was a power suit, and wearing it was akin to announcing your elite status with a silent, sartorial shout. As Rome's reach grew, so did its internal chaos. The Senate, in its quest for control, often found itself at odds with the very military leaders who had helped expand the empire. Generals like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla were more than just soldiers. They were political players with ambitions that sometimes clashed with senatorial desires. These conflicts often blurred the lines between military and political power, turning Rome into a stage for dramatic power struggles that would have given any modern political drama a run for its money. Marius, for instance, was a man of the people, a general who reformed the Roman army by recruiting landless citizens. This was both a stroke of genius and a ticking time bomb, as it created legions loyal to their generals rather than the Senate. Sulla, on the other hand, was the Senate's darling, a staunch conservative who believed in the old ways. Their rivalry was nothing short of epic, culminating in a civil war that saw Rome's streets run red with blood, and the Senate's authority stretched to breaking point. As the dust settled, the Senate found itself in a precarious position, caught between the ambitions of military leaders and the demands of its citizens. The Roman political landscape was as volatile as ever, and the Senate's grip on power was increasingly challenged by the very forces it had helped unleash. Yet, in typical Roman fashion, the Senate's ability to adapt and survive was nothing short of remarkable. It was a testament to their political acumen and sheer tenacity, ensuring that even as Rome was rocked by internal chaos, the Senate remained a central player in the drama that was the Roman Republic. As the curtain fell on this chapter of Roman history, the Senate was left to ponder the lessons learned from the Gracchus brothers and the military machinations of Marius and Sulla. The allure of power was as intoxicating as ever, but the path to maintaining it was fraught with peril. The Senate, ever the political chameleon, would need to navigate these treacherous waters with care if it hoped to continue its reign as Rome's preeminent power broker. But that's a story for another time, as we delve deeper into the intricate and captivating saga of the Roman Senate. Stay tuned for more as we explore the next thrilling chapters of this epic tale. The Roman Senate, ever the embodiment of political intrigue and high drama, was about to face its most charismatic adversary yet, Julius Caesar. This was a man who didn't just step into the political arena. He swaggered in as if he owned the place, armed with a charm that could melt even the iciest of senatorial stares. But let's not pretend that Caesar's charm offensive was merely about winning hearts. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy aimed at consolidating power, and the Senate was about to feel the full force of his political prowess. The rise of Julius Caesar was nothing short of a masterclass in political maneuvering. Born in 100 BCE to a patrician family that had seen better days, Caesar's early life was marked by a series of debts that would make even a modern-day credit card company blush. But here's where the plot thickens. Caesar wasn't content with just paying off his debts. He wanted to climb the political ladder, and he knew that Rome's political game was all about popularity and alliances. Caesar's genius lay in his ability to navigate Rome's complex political landscape with the deftness of a circus acrobat. He formed the first triumvirate in 60 BCE with Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus, a political alliance that was less about friendship and more about mutual benefit. Pompey brought military might, Crassus brought wealth, and Caesar brought ambition. Together, they were a political juggernaut that left the Senate scrambling to maintain its grip on power. But let's not give Caesar all the credit. The Senate, in its infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, failed to recognize the threat that this alliance posed. They were like a group of school teachers trying to control a class of unruly geniuses. While the Senate debated and bickered over minor issues, Caesar was out conquering Gaul. amassing both wealth and a fiercely loyal army. His 8-year campaign in Gaul, from 58 to 50 BCE, wasn't just about expanding Roman territory. It was about building a personal power base that would make even the most seasoned senator green with envy. The Senate's failure to rein in Caesar early on was a classic case of political miscalculation. They underestimated his ambition and overestimated their own ability to control him. By the time they realized the true extent of Caesar's power, he was already a hero in the eyes of the Roman people. His famous dispatch, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, wasn't just a boast. It was a declaration of intent. Caesar was back in Rome, and he wasn't just looking for a seat at the table. He wanted to flip the whole thing over. The Senate, sensing the impending danger, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a reasonable request, at least from their perspective, but Caesar saw it for what it was, a thinly veiled attempt to strip him of his power. So, in a move that would go down in history as one of the boldest gambles, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE with his army, effectively declaring war on the Senate. This was no mere crossing. It was the point of no return, an act of defiance that left Rome teetering on the brink of civil war. As Caesar marched his legions towards Rome, the Senate was thrown into a state of panic. They had hoped to strong-arm Caesar into submission, but instead they found themselves facing the full might of a seasoned general with nothing left to lose. It was a classic case of misjudging the room, akin to trying to extinguish a fire with gasoline. The Senate's attempts to rally support were less about strategy and more about sheer desperation. Now, let's pause for a moment to address the elephant in the room. Was the Senate's opposition to Caesar rooted in a genuine concern for the Republic's well-being, or was it simply a case of protecting their own interests? The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle. The Senate was genuinely alarmed by the prospect of a single man holding so much power, but they were also acutely aware of how much they stood to lose if Caesar's influence continued to grow unchecked. As the civil war unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the Senate's political machinations were no match for Caesar's tactical brilliance. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE was a turning point. Facing off against Pompey's forces, Caesar's troops delivered a decisive victory, effectively sealing the fate of the Republic. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he met a grisly end, leaving Caesar as the undisputed master of Rome. With Caesar's arrival in Rome, the Senate was forced to confront a new reality. Their attempts to curtail his power had only served to strengthen his resolve. Caesar's appointment as dictator for life in 44 BCE was the final nail in the coffin for senatorial authority. The Senate, once the epicenter of Roman political life, was now little more than a ceremonial body, its power eclipsed by the sheer force of Caesar's personality. But let's not rush to canonize Caesar just yet. His concentration of power was as much a threat to Rome's political stability as it was a testament to his formidable skills. While Caesar's reforms, such as the Julian calendar, had a lasting impact, his rule was marked by growing discontent among those who feared the loss of republican values. This brings us to the infamous Ides of March, 44 BCE, a date that would forever be etched in the annals of history. The Senate, in a last-ditch effort to reclaim its authority, hatched a conspiracy to assassinate Caesar. Led by Brutus and Cassius, this motley crew of senators decided that the only way to save the Republic was to eliminate its greatest threat. On March 15, Caesar was surrounded and stabbed 23 times, a brutal end for a man who had once been the darling of the Roman masses. The assassination of Julius Caesar was meant to be a reset button for the Republic, a chance for the Senate to reassert its dominance. But as history would show, it was anything but. Instead of restoring the Republic, Caesar's death plunged Rome into further chaos, leading to a power vacuum that would eventually give rise to the Roman Empire under Augustus. The irony of it all. The Senate's attempt to save the Republic only expedited its demise. In their quest to eliminate a dictator, they paved the way for an imperial system that would forever alter the course of Roman history. It was a textbook case of unintended consequences, a reminder that in the world of politics, the line between hero and villain is often blurred. As we leave this tumultuous chapter in the Senate's history, one thing is clear. The showdown with Caesar was a poignant reminder of the Senate's struggle to adapt to a rapidly changing political landscape. They had attempted to play the role of political strategists, but in the end, their inability to read the room left them as spectators to their own downfall. The Senate's story was far from over, but the lessons learned from Julius Caesar's rise and fall would continue to haunt them as they navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Stay tuned as we delve into the next chapter of this gripping saga, where we'll explore how the Senate tried to pick up the pieces in the wake of Caesar's demise. As the dust settled on Caesar's dramatic exit, the Roman Senate found itself in a predicament that would make any seasoned politician wince. With Caesar gone, the Senate was left to navigate the Roman political minefield, hoping to restore order while sidestepping the pitfalls that had tripped them up so spectacularly. But here's the twist. Their efforts to patch things up only led to the emergence of a new power dynamic, one that would shift Rome from a republic to an empire. Augustus, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir, was about to orchestrate one of history's most cunning political transformations, turning the Senate from a gladiator in the arena of power into a glorified cheering section. Augustus, or Gaius Octavius, as he was known before his rise to power, was a political prodigy. He had the shrewdness of a chess master, seeing moves ahead that others couldn't even fathom. Following Caesar's assassination, Augustus was just 19 years old, yet he maneuvered through Rome's treacherous political waters with the ease of a veteran. He had a knack for rallying support, whether through military might or savvy alliances. By 31 BCE, Augustus had outmaneuvered his rivals, particularly Mark Antony, whom he defeated at the naval battle of Actium. With Antony's defeat, Augustus was the last man standing, the sole architect of Rome's future. But Augustus was no dictator in the mold of Caesar. He understood the importance of appearances. He knew that outright tyranny would only lead to more daggers in the dark. Instead, he cleverly styled himself as princeps, meaning first citizen, giving the impression of humility while consolidating absolute control. It was a masterstroke in public relations. Augustus effectively ended the Republic's facade, but he did so with a wink and a nod, leaving the Senate intact as a ceremonial relic of its former self. The Senate during Augustus's reign was more like a theater troupe than a governing body. Senators continued to wear their togas and hold debates, but everyone knew who held the real power. Augustus had senators voting on policies he had already decided, turning the Senate into a yes-man chorus that rubber-stamped his decrees. The Senate's role in the empire was not unlike a parenthetical aside in a long-winded novel, there for context, but hardly essential to the plot. Yet, despite its reduced status, the Senate remained an institution of prestige. Augustus was smart enough not to strip the Senate of its dignity entirely. He needed its veneer of republicanism to maintain social order. The Senate provided a sense of continuity, a link to the glorious past of Roman governance. Senators retained their privileges, including exemptions from certain taxes and the right to sit in the front row at the Colosseum, where they could enjoy the latest in gladiatorial entertainment, a must-see if you were anyone in Rome. The myth of the Senate, as a bastion of republican virtue, endured, even as it became increasingly clear that it was Augustus who pulled the strings. The romantic image of wise senators deliberating the fate of Rome persisted through art and literature, a testament to the Senate's enduring symbolic power. After all, who wouldn't want to believe in a council of elder statesmen, guiding the empire with wisdom and grace? The reality, of course, was far more mundane. The Senate had become a place where ambition went to retire, a political rest home for those who valued titles over influence. As the empire expanded under Augustus and his successors, the Senate's role became even more perfunctory. The sheer size of the empire, spanning 3 continents and encompassing over 50 million people, required a level of administrative efficiency that the Senate simply couldn't provide. Power was increasingly centralized under the emperor, who appointed local governors and managed the empire's vast military machine. The Senate's jurisdiction was largely confined to ceremonial duties and maintaining the illusion of authority. Yet, in a twist of historical irony, the Senate's diminished role did not diminish its appeal to later generations. The idea of a Senate as a legislative body persisted in political discourse, influencing the development of representative institutions across the world. From the United States Senate to parliamentary systems in Europe. The concept of a deliberative assembly with roots in ancient Rome has endured, even as the original Senate's power faded into history. So why does the Roman Senate still captivate our imagination, despite its often soap opera-level drama and ultimate decline into irrelevance? Perhaps it's because the Senate embodies the eternal struggle between idealism and pragmatism, between the lofty ideals of democracy and the harsh realities of political power. The Senate's legacy is a reminder that even the most venerable institutions can be co-opted, yet their foundational principles can inspire future generations to strive for something better. In the end, the Roman Senate is a tale of ambition and adaptation, of a political body that rose from humble beginnings to become a symbol of republican governance, only to be overshadowed by the very empire it helped create. It's a story of human nature, of the perennial dance between power and principle, and of the ways in which political systems evolve in response to the forces of history. As we close this chapter on the Roman Senate, let's remember it as a testament to the complexity of governance and the enduring allure of political drama. After all, history might have moved on, but the lessons of the Roman Senate remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago.